Good morning. I can welcome everyone to this, the 20th meeting of the Justice Committee in 2013. Can I ask everyone to switch off mobile phones and other electronic devices completely, as the interview of the broadcasting system, even when switched to silent. Apologies have been received from John Pentland and from Alison McInnes, and I welcome back Graham Pearson. He's missed us so much, who is here as John's substitute. Item 1 on the agenda, decision on taking business in private. I'm invited to agree items 3 and 4 in private. Item 3 is a review of evidence gathered so far in Part 1 and Part 6, Section 87 of the Criminal Justice Bill. And item 4, consideration of the Scottish Government's response to our inquiry report on the effectiveness of the provisions of the Title Conditions Act 2003. Are you agreed to take those two items in private? Thank you very much. Item 2, the Government's draft budget 2014-15. This is our first evidence session on the Scottish Government's draft budget, and we'll hear from two panels of witnesses today, the first on the police budget and the second on the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service budget. And I welcome, I'm beginning to think you have names in your seats in here, John Foley, Interim Chief Executive SPA, Paul Rooney, Chair of the SPA's Finance and Investments Committee, Chief Constable Sir Stephen House, Alan MacLeod, Interim Director of Finance and Resources, Police Scotland, Chief Superintendent David O'Connor, President of the Association of Scottish Police Superintendents, Callum Steele, General Secretary of the Scottish Police Federation, and Stevie Diamond, Police Staff, Scotland Branch, Unison. And first of all, I'm going to call you by your names because there's so many ranks going on here, I'm sure to miss it. So if you'll forgive me, it'll just be Stephen House and David O'Connor and so on. Can I thank you for your written submissions, and I'm going straight to questions, as you're aware, from members. And if a member obviously asks a particular question of a particular witness, you're obviously obliged to answer, but don't feel obliged to come in unless you've got something contrary to say about it or something you want to add to it, because we're a big panel. And you've all been here before, except I think for Mr Foley. Is that correct? We're very sweet. Well, you'll let me know later. Right, questions please. John Finney.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. I would like the panel's views on the extent to which the requirement to have the 1,000 additional officers impacts on what you can do within the budget, please.
Stephen House, please.
Chair, thank you. I think it's obvious it has an impact. It's a consideration for us that there is a figure of 17,234, and that's a government requirement. Having said that, without in any way demeaning the importance of it, it becomes a little bit like the furniture. We realise that's the situation, and we work with the positives of that, and the positives are there are a great many police officers in Scotland. And I think I've said on a number of occasions before this group, you'll not find me as a Chief Constable bemoaning the fact that I have a large number of police officers. It means we have to look elsewhere and be more imaginative to find our budget savings.
Anyone else wish to? I'm asking because I know there's a dispute about how this binds. No? John, just go
well, then can I ask the panel, Mr House and Mr Steele in particular, please, what implications, if any, that has, these additional numbers for overtime and the potential to reduce the overtime bill?
Well, the overtime bill is a significant amount of money, and we are looking to reduce it. And indeed, we are reducing it so far this year. I don't see too much of a correlation. I mean, the argument I will put to my officers, my senior officers, is they should need less overtime because they have a high number of officers. But you will members will understand, obviously, there are situations, and many of them, where officers have to be held on duty for unforeseen circumstances, or indeed operations where we simply need specialists to be in place. And I would evidence one of those, most recently the arrest and now charge of 5 people under the Terrorism Act recently, was a huge enterprise, members will appreciate, which meant funding a lot of overtime because officers had to be working, particularly specialist officers with specialist skills. So it's an issue, but we are looking to reduce that overtime budget, and we are being successful in doing that across the board.
Callum Steele, please.
Thank you, Convener. I think the question in its own right is, needs to be developed slightly, because the ability of having 1,000 extra police officers should in its own right mean that the actual requirement for overtime in its own right diminishes, rather than looking at diminishing the cost of it. And clearly, if you've got a greater number of police officers upon which to draw to undertake policing activities, there should also be greater opportunity to develop working systems which mitigate and reduce the use of overtime, rather than simply looking at reducing its cost. One thing the police service has traditionally not been good at has been looking at reducing the use of overtime rather than simply its cost. If we continue to look at reducing the cost rather than reducing the use, we do look at the possibility of burning police officers out, and having a greater pool of individuals upon which to look at designing your working systems in the first place certainly provides greater opportunity to do that.
David O'Connor.
Yeah, just in relation to the overtime conveners, and whilst there has been a great deal of reform, and I think the 17234 has made a significant difference, there needs to be, in our view, some reform of the court systems as well, because there is still a significant amount of police officer time taken up in courts, time spent in court, that costs the public purse. I think there has to be an opportunity as we go forward to look at how the courts operate, particularly at the weekends, even in the evenings, because if we look at the court systems, and if we look at the amount of police overtime that's spent in courts, then I think there's real potential for savings to be made in police overtime.
Do we have any figures for that?
Chair, I can give you some figures in relation to overtime in general, and then probably some in relation to court. When we created the single service, we took the decision to target the overtime budget, and it has been reduced by £10 million. So it's round about, the budget in there for overtime is around about 22 million across the country, is what we would be expecting to see spent this year on overtime. I say that's a reduction of 10 million on the previous year. In terms of court overtime, certainly going back into pre-Police Scotland days, we were looking, I think the figure was around about 4 million in Strathclyde on court overtime. Now that's been reduced through some very good joint working with Crown and with courts, and that work does continue. And I do have to say that. It's not that this is being ignored, but there is still an issue around the country whereby officers are we're having to pay overtime for officers to come in for court duties, and we would like to see that reduced still further. And the Saturday court issue is one that we have continued to press on for a number of years, and will continue to do so because of the pressure that builds up in police cells over the weekends, which we see as unnecessary, really. And I noticed that Lord Carlaway, in his recommendations, talks about increased flexibility of courts, and we would certainly be keen to support that.
Yes, John,
Yeah,
I've got a list, so I'll let the others in after you, please.
Thank you very much. For Mr Diamond, in relation to the overtime, a reducing number of police support staff, are there overtime implications connected with that, Mr Diamond?
There certainly are at the moment. We have, depending on the area that the police staff are being used or where they've been reduced, there are implications, certainly in some of the administrative functions, because there aren't enough staff to be able to carry that out while we're waiting for structural reform to come through. So there are implications for that, and we recently carried out a stress survey which we're analysing just now on the impacts of the cuts on staff that are remaining in the organisation. So certainly there are implications there. However, we appreciate the attempts by Police Scotland to reduce the overtime bill, because ultimately that could have an effect on maintaining the number of police staff in the organisation.
Are we keeping the moment to police numbers, overtime, on that sort of theme? Right, I've got Graham, Elaine, Margaret, then Sandra. Graham, please.
Thank you. Good morning. Again, for the Chief Constable, the 1,000 additional officers that you're obliged to employ, have you got a cost for 1,000 posts? How much is 1,000 posts in your terms, for the record?
I would suggest it's around mid-30s in millions. Yeah.
And you've been well trailed over the months that you felt that the current budget allocation, you found it difficult to anticipate that you would maintain the additional officers in the years ahead. I find it difficult on occasions to understand the notion of operational independence and a Chief Constable's choice about how to police an area where you're obliged to take on these 1,000 additional staff. Could you give us some indication of your own view about the additional allocation of staff Because of that additional allocation, where do you have to look for savings, therefore? And what would be your choice for the future?
There's a lot of fairly fundamental questions in there. I mean, quite clearly, I would want to be protecting operational independence of the Chief Constable, as I'm sure everybody would do. But there are always a number of constraints on any Chief Constable. I mean, budget is a constraint. You could argue, although it's not something I would push in any direction at all, that legislation is a constraint as well. I mean, so we work within the law, we work within a budget. As far as I'm concerned, 1,000 extra cops is something that we work within, as is the government's requirement for no compulsory redundancy for support staff. And frankly, I welcome that one, and I welcome having extra officers, because for me, actually, I arrived in Scotland post the 1,000. I mean, effectively, I've always known the ramp up towards the number. So when I arrived in Strathclyde, we went from 17,250 to 8,500 in a very short period of time, which was the ramp up. I was grateful to do that, and I think you will talk to any operational officers, and I'm sure the Federation and ASS would support this, to say that there may be 17,234 officers, but they're all well occupied, and the public, interestingly, still want to see more policing, not less. So there are difficulties around that. I think I've always said that finding the budget, balancing the budget with the number of police officers we have is a challenge. If you add up all our staff costs, police officers and support staff, and include absolutely everything, it comes to just about 90% of our budget. Therefore, making savings in what's left is always challenging. Now, if you say then that, well, just look at the police officer costs, we're still looking at a proportion of our budget where we have to find some pretty challenging savings. But the answer that we do put out, and I think we are sticking to this, is we're looking everywhere to make savings. And I fully understand Stevie Diamond's concerns and Unison's, and I share them, that we're only looking at civilian support staff. That's not true. So we have looked at delayering of senior ranks. So we've now got a budget less than half of what the chief officer budget was under the 8 forces for Police Scotland. We've made significant savings there. David O'Connor can speak very accurately, I'm sure, to the reduction in ranks of chief superintendent and superintendents. We're reviewing chief inspector and inspector rank numbers as well to look at those. We've talked about, we've taken some money out of overtime. We're looking at a wide range of other issues, including property costs, which are a significant chunk of what is left to us. We have around about 800 buildings in our building stock. Less than half of those are actually operational buildings, which the public would recognise. A significant number of them are residential properties, and that, obviously, people will know, is in parts of the country where historically, traditionally, it was difficult for officers to find somewhere to live. So there's police houses. So there are significant places we're looking at saving money in the fleet. So the fleet is going through a 10% reduction in numbers of vehicles to make savings there. We're looking at all of our procurement contracts to make sure that we are as efficient as possible. Members will realise that the investment in I6 is an investment to save. The authority has been good to support that, and therefore we're looking to save money in the long term out of I6, as we are with all of our IT. And we will be going through significant rationalisation. Again, I think I've mentioned before, it's certainly been picked up. Under 8 forces, there were 10 control rooms, and there still are 10 control rooms across Scotland. I can't tell you what a number is because we haven't worked out the number yet, and we haven't presented to the police authority, who we will present to for their views and for their input, rather than just their decision, but for their actual helping us to create the answer. But we won't need 10 control rooms going forward. So there are a number of areas where we can look to reduce costs, and we are determined to do that, and we try to do that before it comes to staff. But the problem is, of course, that the next biggest chunk after police officer costs is support staff costs, and we're not restricted in looking at staff officers at staff costs, except for we can't have compulsory redundancy, and we would much rather work through the voluntary scheme, and we are finding significant savings in public money through the voluntary schemes.
Before we move on, can I Steele, you wanted to come in there?
Thank you, Convener. And it's principally surrounding the issue of the operational independence of the Chief Constable and how the 1,000 extra officers will or in some way can be considered to impact on that. And I'm sure the Chief Constable will speak for himself. In fact, he absolutely does speak for himself. But my observation is that there is a greater flexibility with 1,000 across the whole of Scotland to be deployed as the Chief Constable sees fit than existed previously, where there were specifically funded officers from local authorities that had to be deployed in the confines of the Old Force area, which in my mind suggested that areas that could afford extra police officers, whether they necessarily needed them or not, there was an obligation on the Chief Constable to put them policing in that area, which in itself could be considered to be impinging on the operational independence of the Chief Constable if we developed that particular line in that particular direction. So 1,000 across the whole of Scotland, to my mind, is a greater flexible approach to the deployment of police resources than that which existed previously, where there were funded officers for specific deployment in local authority areas.
It was a point I was going to come on to later, but I'll address it now. Previously, there had been local authority funding for police officers across Scotland. From the answer that we've had from Calm, is that an indication that that has now ceased and that these 1,000 police officers replaced that? Or do you anticipate that local authorities, or you hope they will maintain their finance support?
I think, I mean, I completely agree with the principle of what Callum says, but just to make sure members aren't in any way unclear on this, at the same time as Parliament decided we would have 1,000 extra police officers, we also, certainly in Strathclyde, we spoke to a certain number of councils. In fact, I spoke to all councils, and a number decided to invest in extra policing. So Glasgow paid for, and still pays for, 100 extra police officers. North and South Lanarkshire pay for extra police officers, and so do most of the councils in the West. The numbers are quite small in some areas, and sometimes it's campus cops that they will pay for. But the principle is still there. Certainly Edinburgh has significant funding for extra police officers, and members will have seen publicity recently about considerations in the Edinburgh City Council budget to reduce that funding. I have to say I understand entirely they're under significant pressure as well on budget savings. We understand that to be the situation. And actually, all councils, in my experience, every year review, do we want to keep funding the extra police officers? And in most instances, they decide it's good value for money and keep doing it. So there are still, I think it's over 300 police officers around Scotland who are funded solely by local councils to work in their area. But we always, speaking for myself previously in the West, and I'm quite sure I'm speaking on behalf of previous chief constables elsewhere, there was always an understanding that operational deployment would in the main be around the duties which the councils wanted, which was local visible policing. But there would be occasions when, because of the needs of the service, those officers would be deployed somewhere else for a brief period of time, a demonstration or an industrial dispute or something like that.
I think that's very useful, and I think David McCletchy at the time, late David McCletchy, actually clarified that when we were asking previously that this money from councils wouldn't just disappear into the large fund, but would be clear and purchase a number of police officers. That's very helpful. I've got somebody else to come in before, another witness to come in, Steve Diamond.
With regards to the 17234, we have grave concerns about the way that some of these officers are being deployed at the moment, and that is in relation to backfill for police staff posts. And we've recently, since 1st of April, I think we've lost about 450 police staff posts through backfill, and a significant number of those posts are being backfilled by, through VRER, and a significant number are being backfilled by police officers. And certainly some proposals that have come forward by the organisation to allow us to meet that, the budgetary constraints of this year, will mean that police officers aren't going to be doing patrol work. They're going to be doing work that still remains for police staff who are no longer going to be used by the organisation. So the 17234 is almost a notional figure, and the Chief Constable is having to make operational decisions to backfill for police staff.
Well, Chief Constable, I was going to call you Steve first and forgot to call you anyway. Are you using them to backfill?
I've said before to this meeting that we have no policy and no strategy of backfilling of civilian posts when they go with police officers. That remains the case. at this moment in time. But I'm certainly not suggesting that the analysis that Steve has given is incorrect. There are, of course, occasions where backfilling will take place, but there have always been occasions when backfilling takes place. So if a member of staff has to go off on a training day, then and that job is essential, they'll be backfilled with a police officer.
I think the question is it on the increase rather than has it always happened?
Yeah, well, under the terms of how staff go, in the most instances, jobs are closed down. So in the vast majority, there's no backfilling to be done. I don't agree with Steve on this. I understand where he's coming from. We don't see that the 450 posts or so, and it will be more than that by the end of the financial year, are being backfilled by police officers. And just to be clear, he said that the 17,234 is to an extent notional. Can I absolutely assure you that on a weekly basis we review the number of police officers in Scotland, and it is far from notional. I think what he means is, they may not be out there operationally, but then 17,234 and numbers above that have never all been out on the street. There are always jobs which police officers do that keep them off the street to a degree. We try to minimise that. But they're not all out on the street all the time. I wish they could be.
Just to clarify the point about the 17,234 and the 300-odd local authority funded officers, does that mean that the government pay for 1,000 additional officers and then on top of that you have 300-odd local authority paid people, or is it 1,000 in total taking account of the 300-odd?
It's not. Unfortunately, I wish the answer was a very clear one, because I'd like to give you a very clear one, and I'd like to have understood it very clearly myself. It's not that easy for I think, a relatively simple fact, which is some of the funding from councils came before the 1,000 extra cops. Therefore, it's not as clear-cut as they're on top as well. But we aren't at 17,234. We're above that. Some of those that we are above is extra money from councils.
And I was coming round to the point that Stevie was coming to with the support staff. I asked you about where you look for the savings, therefore, because I think that the authority has set a fairly robust challenge for you. And it sounded from your reply, having gone through all the various elements, that a major part of those savings will come from staff redundancies. I know that there's this counter closure thing that's ongoing in the staff that's involved there. I understand too that the people who serve citations and so forth, they will go too. I find it hard to understand. We reckon that around 1,200 posts have gone over the last few years from the support staff side. There must be an element whereby these functions need to be performed by someone. It's not merely you switch a light out and that work no longer needs done. So presumably, although you wouldn't desire it, police officers must do that work. And you've also got a very substantial reform unit, which is virtually staffed by police officers who do the administration of the reform process. What's your strategy in trying to ensure that a balanced workforce is ahead for the future, and that the support function is performed by people who are not warranted?
Again, a number of questions. I wouldn't particularly argue with your figures in terms of going back a few years. There's no doubt that the future will bring more staff leaving the organisation, and that will take place over the next few years. At the moment, we don't have a strategy to backfill with police officers. Again, I'm sorry for interrupting you there. This thing about we don't have a strategy for backfilling. Purposely.
But the reality is that there are human beings who wear police uniforms who are doing office work. Now, it might not be your particular strategy, but if we've lost over 1,000 people and there are police officers who are now doing that work, whether you call it a strategy or not, the reality is we're paying for police officers who should be out enforcing the law and detecting criminals, but they're doing administrative tasks, whether you want it that way or
I think
not.
that's too simplistic an analysis, if I may say so. So, for example, some of the staff that we're losing are from posts where police officers just wouldn't do it. So we're losing through rationalisation of workshops. We're losing mechanics. We're not.
Some of the 1,200 jobs, I don't mean all of them, will be backfilled.
Well, some. Again, I have to go back to, it's a large organisation, it covers the country. We don't have a policy for it. So when it happens, it's happening on the odd example. And let me try and explain why I'm confident in saying that. We're looking, as you've indicated, to reduce the opening hours of some of our front counters across Scotland. Then we're looking to close some of those front counters. We're not at the moment looking to close any police stations, but just public access to be limited in some areas. In some areas where we think it's particularly quiet, no access to that particular police office. The easiest thing for us to do, to avoid all the negative publicity and concern for the public, and I don't want to concern the public, would be to say, well, we have to make savings. We have 150 support staff who work in front counters who want to go under voluntary redundancy, so we'll let them go and we'll backfill with police officers. That would be the easy thing to do. We would avoid all the bad press. We would keep the front counters open. The public wouldn't be concerned. I appreciate they are concerned about this sort of thing. But that is not the sensible thing to do. So instead what we're doing is we're surveying and consulting around the front counter opening hours to say we have to reduce this because we don't want to backfill with police officers. We want the police officers out on the streets. We want them operationally responding to the public. So we're going to look again at just how appropriate is our opening hours policy across Scotland. Is it actually modern? I don't believe it is a modern response. I think it actually is based on a very old-fashioned concept of if you want a cop, you go to the local police station. And most people don't do that anymore. There are some exceptions, but most people will phone. Hence, so we've got a communication system that allows that. So we're looking to limit any backfilling that we do. In relation to the citation service, this has been a particular issue, and I know the unions are concerned, and again, I understand why they're concerned about it. What we've effectively said is we're going to give that work to the police officers. But the police officers that it will be given to are not working in an office, in a unit. They're actually out on the street, knocking on doors and looking to deliver the citations. My view is that's exactly what police officers should be doing in the community. They should be out, they should be knocking on doors, sometimes the doors of people that we want to speak to quite urgently. Actually will increase the amount of time they're out, visible to the public. To me, that's a sensible thing to do when we have to cut our budget, which we do. You said that the authority had given us a significant chance, a challenge we've accepted. The budget cuts for this year that we're looking to are around about £64 million. We're about £3 million short of balancing the budget. We're just over halfway through the year, so I'm pretty confident that we will balance this year's budget, and we are making significant inroads on next year's budget and the year after that as well. So the challenge is there. It is difficult. We expect it to be difficult. I will always maintain the right to say in public it's difficult, but that's the job that we've taken on.
And the police officers in the reform unit?
I'm not entirely sure that the information there is up to date. There were significant numbers as we moved towards the 1st of April, but that's been downsized quite significantly. I haven't got the details of that. I'm quite happy to bring them forward and let you have them after this if I can.
I don't know if...
Well, nobody else has, as I've said, if anybody else wants to comment, they'll let me know. And nobody else has indicated they wish to comment. So you can come back in, as you know, I'm very lax. That's my word for it. Elaine, followed by Margaret, followed by Sandra, please.
Yes, I was interested just in following up a little bit more about the civilian staff figures. I mean, on your own estimates of Police Scotland, there'll be some 800 police staff will have been lost this year. They'll contribute something to like 25.5 million to the savings in the following year. They've said 14, 15. How many more staff are likely, civilian staff are likely to go next year? Because that's not going to cover your entire, I mean, your financial pressures are much greater than that. So are you anticipating losing hundreds more civilian staff?
As I said in answer to an early question, the civilian staff is not the only place we're looking. We're looking everywhere else. And I'm pretty optimistic that in terms of property, we'll find more money going forward. And members will appreciate, actually, property is quite a difficult one to get into quickly. We have made some progress in getting out of some expensive leases so far this year, which has helped save us some money, but we will be looking to rationalise the 800 or so buildings which the authority have in their portfolio as we go ahead. We'll also be looking at procurement, we'll be looking at ICT, so we'll be looking at everything. But having said that, we will still have to come back to the fact that the second biggest chunk of our budget is civilian staff. So there's no doubt in our minds that there will be, as the years go ahead, further reductions of civilian staff. And I think I have to recognise also that I think the Scottish Government recognises that's the case as well, because they're putting substantial amounts of money into a reform pot, now having announced that there will be some reform money available in 2015-16 as well, which is a new indication from them. I think about £70 million in a pot for that year. Now, a substantial amount of the police reform money so far has gone into the VR-ER scheme. And I think that's an indication that they're expecting, and we are expecting as well, that it won't be a short, sharp, it will be a longer process. And again, I think that's inevitable. I have to go back to the control room issue. We have about 1,400 support staff working across the control rooms and contact centres in Scotland. Somewhere up to about 450 of them indicate they'd like to take voluntary redundancy or early retirement. We can't let any of them go at this moment in time because we would have to backfill with cops because they're all doing essential jobs. And they will be until we can rationalise the number of control rooms. Once we can do that, which is some while away, not weeks or months, probably years away to rationalise all those buildings, then we can look at our civilian support staff in control rooms as well, and we will be able to reduce the number significantly, and we will actually help to improve the service because the IT will be more integrated in a few years' time than it currently is. So I think rather than just look in the next couple of weeks and months, we have to look ahead as we move on with transforming the service. There's a lot to be done, and it will take a number of years. So there will be more civilian staff, voluntary redundancy and early retirement in the years ahead.
Unison argue in their submission to us that there's not really been any detailed work done on about the sort of the workforce balance that's required to maintain low crime figures, and in a sense you're taking forward this reform in a constrained way, because if that piece of work hasn't been done, which actually says this is the balance you require between civilian staff, police officers and so on, that then makes it difficult actually to get the optimum workforce balance. And I think actually, I don't know whether Unison want to comment on that, but that seems to be the argument they're making, actually that piece of work needs to be done as part of the reform process.
An argument I would agree with. I think that piece of work does need to be done. I think it's foolish to try and do it within the first 12 to 18 months of a new organisation up and running. We need to bed in first. And there are very many questions. People say to me often, well, why 17,234 is an arbitrary figure? And I think everybody agrees it is an arbitrary figure because it was 1,000 extra cops on the day when there happened to be 16,234. I don't say it was the wrong decision. I think it was a good decision, but it's an arbitrary figure. Could we manage with one less? Well, quite possibly. But the question I would have to ask, and this is why it's not just for us in the police service to do this research, it's actually for a much wider group of shareholders, stakeholders, and including the public. What sort of police service do you want? What does Scotland want? What does it regard as acceptable crime levels? Are any crimes of violence acceptable? Or do we want to focus on other issues? What about all the various assets of policing that we carry out? It's not a right. Well, 17,234 is not the right number. So what is the right number? Then we look at, well, what about civilianisation? There are huge arguments in favour of civilianisation, but there are also situations where there are jobs which are currently being done, which police officers used to do, no longer do, and you can argue there are some benefits either way. Take, for example, licensing, particularly alcohol and pubs and clubs. There's a number of parts of Scotland where there are licensing units within my divisions, and some have all police officers, some have a mix, and some are all civilians. Now, my view is there should be a mix in licensing units, because actually you need a uniform, you need a power to go in, inspect premises, and actually show the presence of law and order in some pubs and clubs and ask some difficult questions. What sort of mix of workforce do we want? I don't think it's an easy, can we sort this out by the end of the year debate. And I do think we should have at least a year, possibly 18 months, to decide what sort of service going forward do we want. I should just point out, in terms of performance, violent crime has been coming down. It continues to go down. It's down about 14% this year on last year. Most other kinds of crime are coming down as well. I've referred to the counter-terrorism arrests yesterday. We've got the Commonwealth Games coming up. There's a whole load of things that are successful in terms of performance at this moment. And I think the public would be less patient with, well, actually, we're going to put up with more crime because we'll have a smaller police service, smaller budget. We're prepared to put up with a bit more crime and disorder. I don't think many members of the public would be prepared to. I'm not suggesting you're saying that, but I don't think they would. So I think there's a bit of a constraint around.
I could just see the headlines.
Yeah, well, probably happened now I've said it.
No, you've redeemed it.
Oh, good.
Retrieved it.
Would it not be easier, though, to have that discussion, if you like, if you don't have, within the professional force, with stakeholders, without politicians telling you, we're set in one part of that equation and you're not allowed, you have to keep that set in stone and you have to work around it, rather than allowing you the flexibility to determine that yourselves?
I'm afraid not for me personally, because I would be taking 17234 as a starting point and saying, if I was being questioned by any panel to see, well, how many do you want? 17234 would be a bottom line figure. I'd want more than that. I could use more than that, quite happily.
Or at this moment, I think.
Well, I think it's foolish publicly to say, not to say we could use more.
I know, I understand. I know. I've just 17234 emblazoned in my memory now. We're all going to remember that number come hell or high water.
Yes.
I'm going to let David O'Connor, you want in, do you? Yes?
Just supporting what the Chief has actually said there, and we as an association supported police reform and supported the introduction of a single police service in Scotland, but we also, one of the caveats that we put in place was the need to have a balanced workforce as we actually roll forward. And I do agree that, and the time isn't right just now because we're still trying to make the savings, but I think as we roll forward we need to look at what is a community policing model, what does it look like, what is the balance between police officers and police staff, and I think that is something that the service needs to look at potentially next year to make sure that we do get the balanced workforce.
Alan raised his eyebrows, I think. He was going to say something other than raise your eyebrows.
Yes, Convener, I do. And whilst I understand that the point that's being made about having a balanced workforce and the number of particular resources that are required to undertake particular tasks, I am alert to the reality of what happens in these kind of things, and that is that if your starting point is 17,234, your answer is 17,234. It happened in all of the old forces when there was exercises undertaken to find out, or at least to attempt to find out, how many police officers were required in each of those forces. And Quelle Supree, the answer came out at the answer for the number of officers that were there at any particular moment in time, and indeed the number of support staff that were there at any moment in time. When we're looking at the issue of reform, and I know that the purpose of today is to look at today's budget, we have to recognise that this is against a background of trying to save over £1 billion. We're trying to deliver 1 year's free worth of policing by 25-26. Now, that's not going to be managed without some particularly difficult decisions that have to be looked at, and they're going to be undertaken on a year-by-year basis. But I am in absolutely no doubt that we are in a far better position to be able to respond to the challenge of finding that £1 billion by 25-26 as a consequence of having a single service than having to find that £1 billion, or in fact probably in excess of £1 billion, from across 8 of the previous forces.
Yes, Mr Rooney.
Thank you, Convener. It's just to complete the panel's agreement in terms of the timing around this. I think the challenge that we are facing at the moment is about the coming 2 financial years, and that's where the focus has to be. I think the review that has been suggested is one that we would all certainly support, but I believe that would be the point in which you would actually start to look at that piece of work. I think the issue that we have just now is to make sure that we maintain that level of performance as the Chief Constable has outlined. That's what the public expect us to do, but at the same time identify what financial opportunities will be going forward, but at the same time ensuring we're moving towards, you know, a 21st century police service for Scotland.
Do you want to, Mr. Yes, Steve Diamond, yes.
We're absolutely, I think we're all in agreement that the time is absolutely critical in this for planning. The problem that we see at the moment is that police staff are being targeted to maintain, to get this budget in line. If and the structures and things like that we see are coming through which are reducing police numbers are acting in isolation. If we take that in a bigger context, when we're looking at partnership working over the next few years, where we're going to be looking for savings by working with the Crown, etc., then it doesn't bode well that we are having to make harsh decisions just now which could have an effect a couple of years down the line. And you know, 17234 was put in place whenever there was money about. The money isn't about just now, and that we really need a review of that 17234 to see if it is best value for money at the moment.
I'll leave that one just now because I appreciate and thank you. It was in your written submissions. Thank you for that. Elaine, can I move on to Margaret, followed by Sandra, followed by Roderick?
If I could return briefly to the question of some of the council funding of the 320 officers, I think it is. If that were to be withdrawn, are there contingency plans in place?
If all the money was to be withdrawn all in one go, then we would be down on our number of officers. But we do have firm agreements with a number of the councils that the money will not be withdrawn instantly. As I say, I think it's perfectly understandable that all councils will review that funding and look at their budgets. And you know, high-profile-wise, Edinburgh City is clearly doing that right now. We've made it very clear, in I hope a very balanced and matter-of-fact way to Edinburgh City Council, that the money does go to fund extra police officers, and if the money is reduced in some way, then we will have to reduce that proportionately in terms of the number of officers that are available to police Edinburgh. If we have ongoing recruitment, so we're recruiting probably about 50 to 60 officers every 6 weeks. So we would, if we were given notice that the money was withdrawn or being withdrawn, and as I say, it wouldn't all be withdrawn in one go, then we would simply turn up the recruiting tap. We have well over 1,500 people waiting to join the organisation.
Could you give an estimate of the number of police officers that are currently working on producing papers on police reform?
Not as I sit here today, no. I can certainly try and provide that information for you, but not at this moment in time.
Mr. Diamond could help us out.
That's difficult to say, to be perfectly honest. However, the number, whenever you've got a diminishing pot of members of police staff who have specific roles to do, then, to be honest, it's perfectly understandable that if there's going to be someone involved in a project to look at police numbers, it's going to be police officers.
I was given to understand there was about 200 currently working on police reform, including things like police station counter review.
Oh, there's shaking heads there. Yes.
I need to be clear, seeing as this is a public meeting, I don't recognise that figure at all.
Well, perhaps you could look into it, since you can't give me a figure this morning, Chief Constable.
Well, I can tell you 200 is not accurate. It's a vast overestimate.
Would you agree that in looking at the 41.6 million savings, the vast majority of it has come not from procurement, not from property, but from looking at savings in terms of people and police staff.
Before I absolutely will answer your question, can I just say, though, just again for the record, the £41 million is not something we work with. The best I can explain it as, in terms of what we're looking at is the budget gap. The budget gap that we have is in this year is 64 million. That includes the 41, but it's on top of that because we have inflationary pressures and a number of other pressures. So our budget gap is 64 million, not 41 million. And moving forward, it's about another 65 for the next 2 years as well. In terms of where the money is coming from, the bulk of money comes from the reduction in support staff. But that does not mean to say that we don't look everywhere to try to find that money. And as I said earlier, as an example, I think the figure we saved on chief officers and senior officers was about 3 million a year in terms of reduction in numbers. So we look to find money everywhere. I've mentioned the reduction in overtime. which we've also imposed. That saved us £10 million. So there is a significant effort to find it across the board, not just in support staff.
Looking at the counter staff specifically, where I think you raised today, maybe not everyone will disappear there, but some will. These people aren't just sitting at a counter doing nothing. They're involved in administrative tasks. Is that not the case?
It varies wildly across the country. There are some who are occupied doing other tasks, and there are some who our view is that their main role is front counters and they're waiting for people to come in. And indeed, there are some police officers that are very, very busy, and civilian staff have no time to do anything other than deal with front counter inquiries.
Well, given that's the case, then obviously that administrative work has got to be done by someone. And if it's done by frontline officers, then it seems to be a very false economy to put a frontline officer at an average salary of, say, 36,000 deployed to do that administrative work, when a civilian staff job is an average of 21,000, 23,000. That doesn't seem to make economic sense.
Well, it would do, but that's why, as I say, we're taking steps to reprofile the opening hours that we're looking at. Because if we didn't, we would have to say to the police officers, you need to backfill, not just for the front counter, but for the whole of the administrative task. And what we're trying to do is to cut down on those tasks by reducing, where it's appropriate, opening hours of front counters. The other thing to say is it's not an automatic default that if a member of support staff who's working on a front counter leaves the organisation voluntarily, that work is picked up by a police officer. There are still many other support staff left behind who are still working and can take on that extra work. We're looking to be more efficient here. We're not simply looking at, well, we'll take all civilian jobs and give them to police officers.
Again, this morning you've said, Chief Constable, that means a year, maybe 18 months to bed in, and I get the impression, perhaps wrongly, that in your written submission you've said that there were a number of factors that you were looking at that made it a real challenge. Wage inflation had been significantly increased beyond the assumptions made during police reform, this kind of thing. So this, together with the police counter, I don't get any impression there's proactive work going on here. There's lots of reactive work talking about police on the beat. But as you'll know, the budget thrust and the Cabinet Secretary's thrust is for preventative spend. But I'm not hearing that from you this morning. I'm hearing firefighting.
Well, we've not really asked about preventative spend. We have now, so...
I'm sorry, I'm not really clear. I understand the question. Are you asking about preventative work and a financial strategy, or are you asking about proactive policing?
I'm suggesting that counter work doesn't have to be looked at as something which is a drain on resources, but which should actually be developed to be a more proactive interface with the public. And if that prevented crime, then there's a potential saving there. Has that aspect been looked at all?
Yeah, I'm not sure I really, to be honest, agree with that will prevent crime. But I mean, in terms of the consultation exercise that we've launched, and which finishes at the end of this month, we are in debate with a great many councils and other partners around Scotland to look at working in contact points, council contact points in local libraries, in fire stations, particularly in rural areas. We're looking at working. It was an idea that was again picked up by the press from previous comments, but we're looking at working in supermarkets. The reality is, as many people will acknowledge, I think footfall at supermarkets is massive. If we put a police presence in there, then we will get more access to the public. I'll use an example. Glasgow Airport. Many of you might be familiar with Glasgow Airport. There is a police office at Glasgow Airport. It's particularly difficult to find. It's parked at the back of an administrative block, and I would dare say, well, it's a fact, I think, is if you're a regular user of the airport, you wouldn't know it was there because it's not anywhere in your eye line. So we're looking at reducing or stopping the opening hours of that office, but instead putting a kiosk into the main area of the airport where all the public go past and all the public will see. So I don't accept your comment, actually. I think that if you look at what we're doing with front counters, it's an attempt, and I think a good one, to try to modernise our service. We know that the vast majority of the public contact us via phone. Our use of electronic media, particularly Facebook, Twitter and other forms of contact, is rocketing. Over 55% of our non-emergency calls...
Chief Constable,
well,
the phone in particular, what kind of assessment is done of how effective that is? Because I don't think I'm alone as an MSP in hearing so many people just giving up phoning the police, not getting a satisfactory answer. So what kind of checks and balances are in there to make sure that that really is working effectively and isn't a duplication of effort?
Well, again, I'm grateful for the question, actually, because it allows me to talk about 101. What we're doing across the country is rolling out a national number that everybody can remember to contact their local police office, instead of having to have somewhere written down a nondescript number which will get you through to a police station. I can guarantee you, in my 33 years as a police officer, the biggest complaint I've had in general from the public has been, when trying to contact the police, that when they phone their local police station, they don't get an answer. Well, the reason they don't get an answer is because they're not set up as contact centres. 101 will allow people to be put through to somebody who can answer their questions. They just have to remember the one number now. The figures in relation to the use of electronic media are rocketing. That's how the public want to deal with the police. That's how they want to get and receive information and give information. So all of our research says we have got figures on 101 and our phone compliance. I'm perfectly happy to let you have those after this meeting.
Sounds very encouraging, Chief Constable. If I could press you,
because I'm still bothered about the money from local authorities, which you... Do we know what that funding, the amount of money that goes in from local authorities, is an overall figure?
About 12 million.
I mean, I'm not good at this stuff. So I'm looking at your pie chart here on your submission, where you've got income, a thing with income, and it says minus 58.8 million, down 5%. What is that? I don't know what that is. Somebody could maybe just explain what that is. I mean, we've got the property costs, other people, police staff.
Sorry, that figure, Chair, sorry, I had to ask about that. That in terms of, that is the money that we receive into the organisation. So that's offset against our budget savings that we have to make. It's not all about money from local councils.
But it's down. 5%. What is that?
No. It's
oh, I don't.
That's the percentage that it contributes to our budget. That's why it's that's why it's a minus figure.
How can it contribute if it's a minus? I'm a bit lost. Right. I know I should have paid attention to Ms Campbell in arithmetic. Mr MacLeod.
Indeed, Convener. No, sorry, I didn't mean that you should have been paying attention when you were at school.
I've been telling you that for years. Just tell me what that means. I don't understand a minus can be a contribution.
If you were to add up the expenditure elements within that pie chart, you would come to 58 million more than the total budget. So we have a gross expenditure budget. We then have an income, and it's presented. Income is presented as a negative, because it's set off against the expenditure, and you therefore arrive at the net budget of £1,062,000,000.
I've actually understood that. I just didn't know what that meant.
Yeah.
And it's 12 million from local authorities, and that the policemen they purchase are within the famous 17234 figure or thereabouts. So they're in there, and they buy extra time, as it were, councils. Is that correct?
Indeed, the income
right.
from the local authorities is included in that 58 million figure, yes.
I'm with you now. Fine. Sorry about that. I just didn't... It was puzzling me and it was niggling, and I now understand. Miss Campbell's not been a total failure, I don't think. Yes?
Chief Constable, you mentioned the savings from I6. What cognizance have been taken of the reforms that are in the pipeline potentially, and the impact on that in I6? I'll give you one example. Investigative liberation, the cost of adapting IT to cope for that, and other things in the pipeline.
The I6 programme, as members will be well aware, is a pretty sophisticated programme that we've been working on for a number of years. It has worked quite closely with the Carlaway recommendations. Obviously, That's not set in stone yet, so we have to wait and see what your deliberations bring in relation to that. But it is flexible enough, and we are at an early stage that it can take on changes in legislation. And you're quite right to flag it. I mean, these are significant changes that could come along in terms of police work in practice, but the systems within I6 are A, an early enough stage, and B, we have cognizance of the fact that there will be changes as we go through the process of building I6, partly driven by things such as Carlaway recommendations.
Yes, Mr Rooney.
Thank you. Just to come in on I6 from the authorities' perspective, you know, in terms of looking at the business case and signing off the business case, it was based on the savings going forward. That's the case where you're looking at from an authority perspective. Chief Constable has brought forward a proposal which in the longer term will allow further reforms of policing going forward. So it's just to make sure the committee is aware that these decisions are not taken in isolation, and actually part of the overall financial strategy that the authority is putting in place going forward, both in the short term and the longer term.
I can also say to the committee that the subcommittee on policing did quite a lot and is monitoring the whole system, the ICT, but so that's part of our, which we meet again this week. We're meeting 3 times this week. Well, we should get medals. Margaret, have you?
I was just one other aspect, and that was the training of officers, again, for the identification of something like vulnerable adult and anything else that they may need training for, and also the impact of any potential abolition of corroboration and an increase in cases being brought. What kind of cognizance has been taken of these potential reforms?
We had a meeting yesterday of the Finance and Investment Committee of the Police Authority, at which I was at, and there was a presentation given to the police authority members present by the Chief Superintendent, who is leading the work on Carlaway implementation, and he gave some indication of where the costs are expected to come from, and I think there is some work that he has in train in terms of the amount of the money that is potential. It's relatively, I think, early days in terms of what's going to cost money, where is extra expense going to come from. There may well be increased cases if corroboration goes. We would also look to see if we can offset any increases through flexible court sittings, and again, that's included in the recommendations as well. We would be particularly keen, as has already been mentioned by Chief Superintendent O'Connor, in relation to Saturday courts, which would significantly free up pressure on our custody cells and help us to meet requirements under human rights. So there are significant implications for it. We have got costings, and again, I'd be happy to let you have those. I don't have them. I don't have them with me, but I'm happy to let you have those.
Can I ask, were the police not consulted when the financial memorandums, or memoranda, I should say, of both of these bills were published? So,
yes, we were.
So really, they should be in line with that.
Yes.
And are they in line with that?
I believe they are. There's no, we have.
We should see it, because obviously all ancillary costs should be in the financial memorandum.
Yeah.
Would that include training?
Would that include training?
Yeah. Training, specifically for the Carlaway recommendations, yes, and we are looking at a substantial package of training for every officer in the country.
Mr Rooney?
Yeah. Just as Chief Constable has referenced, that is a presentation we called for in the Finance and Investment Committee for the very reasons that you've alluded to. There will be financial implications. They're not unforeseen costs because, you know, as you say, the bill is in the public domain. However, it is actually part of the financial planning we're having to put in place. It is obviously additional pressure that we're recognising and preparing for.
Well, I think it would be useful for the committee to know if there's been any change of heart with regard to the financial implications of both of these pieces of legislation, either in a downward or an upward trajectory as a result of these meetings, because we have to give consideration to whether or not the financial memorandum of bill is correct as it can be. So it would be useful to the committee. Yes, Mr Rooney.
Yeah, Convener, it was just to say that the purpose of yesterday's presentation was obviously to actually have a review of what we are projecting in terms of the financial implications, and I'm pleased to say that some of those costs were actually downwards, but at the same time it is something that we are monitoring on an ongoing basis, and it is, as Chief Constable has said, it is actually something that is evolving, so we will continue to monitor that.
Yeah, we're going to stage 2 of the victims and witnesses bill, so I think we really need to kind of know about that one in particular. Criminal justice has got a way to run yet into next year, but it would be useful for the committee to know the financial impact, any changes therein. Sandra, followed by Roderick, followed by Graham.
Thank you very much, Convener. Just on the back of that particular question about the budgets, etc., the SPA's capital budget is greater for 2013-14 than it was previously. Will that have any implications? Will that have any implications on what we've just been talking about that Margaret Mitchell had raised, or what difference will that make?
Personally speaking, Sandra, I believe the increase in capital is actually in future years, it's further years. It won't have an implication in terms of what we have specifically spoken about in terms of Carloway, but going forward, you know, that capital will be put to good use, especially when we're actually looking to make further reforms which will generate savings, so it's very much welcomed.
I beg your pardon, sorry, I'm glancing down. Mr Foley.
I'd just like to advise the committee that SPA are playing a much more proactive role in engaging with our colleagues in PSOS in the capital budgets moving forward and this year. And we have a number of new processes and procedures in relation to greater partnership working. So we're actually preparing and putting forward proposals together, and we'll work on the financial strategy towards the end of this year, and we'd hope to have that in place by March 31st, prior to year end.
Of course. It was just on the back of that I wanted to ask that particular question. I forgot to say good morning, gentlemen. It is all gentlemen that's there. Yeah, possibly could. There's a couple of issues that I wanted to raise in regards to previous evidence and obviously support staff and the redundancies. Now, I've spoken to a number of support staff who want to take the voluntary redundancy, and basically they're saying it's not moving quick enough for them. So I'd like an update on that particular one. And the other issue that I would like to raise is in regards to, I don't know if the panel would agree with me, but obviously we're looking at a budgetary system, but reform is not just a black and white process. And I entirely agree with you on the court system, after having spent 4 days myself sitting in a court as a witness and still never been called. Basically, there has been improvements there, but I would just like to know when you would expect further improvements in that particular one, and also in an operational manner. We were talking.
All the questions in at once, you know. Well, I'd like you to one at a time. You've waited a long time.
I don't mind asking them all just now.
No, but they might. It's harder for the panel. So
okay, I'll leave the last operational manner.
So you've got staff who are desperate to take redundancy and can't take it. Must be bad for morale. And the other one was waste of court time.
Yes.
Chair, I mean, I agree with the observation. Personally, I spend a lot of time talking to colleagues around the country. There is a deal of frustration. There's a feeling of hurry up and wait. I think that we announced that there would be a voluntary scheme, and people want to get on with it because people want to get on with their lives. And if people want to leave, then often they want to leave now. And if they see a package which will bring them some financial benefit, which it will do, then they want access to it. We do understand that, but we have to follow employment legislation, and we have to make sure that we're consulting with the unions. And I know the unions would like more consultation, but we have to follow a very strict timetable, which includes taking all the proposals to the HR committee of the police authority. They have to be content with the way we're going about this, that it's been done appropriately. We are obliged to consult with individual members of staff and to have group consultations and to talk to the unions through our JNCC system. So you can look at a time lag quite easily of between us taking a view that that post can go to the person actually leaving the organisation can easily be 6 months. Easily 6 months to comply with various pieces of legislation. The problem actually, though, is much larger because there are a great many people who would like to go under voluntary redundancy, and I've referred to them already, many of them in the control rooms and contact centres, who we aren't letting go. Now, I think for them there is some reassurance which we can give, and we've only recently been informed of this, but the government has, as I said earlier, has put £70 million into the reform pot for 15-16. Now, that's the first time that's been that's been discussed, which allows us to say, I hope with a degree of confidence, but it will be a decision for the authority and for the government, who obviously the reform money is their money, that we could see an extension of the VR-ER scheme all the way through to 15-16, which would give some reassurance to people who want to go, that they're not going to express a desire to go, see colleagues and friends going, and because they're in a particular job, we don't let them go. And then we say, that's it, that's the end of the scheme. And they're thinking, well, I wanted to go, and I can go, but I don't get any extra benefit from going. Hopefully this means that we'll be able to continue that to 15-16. I do understand concerns and annoyance. I've had a number of emails from staff saying, you told us we could go, why can't we go? My friend's gone, why can't I go? I do understand it. It's one of the biggest frustrations people have, but it's important that the unions play a full part in the consultation, so they're content that we're looking after their members as much as we can, that we're treating them properly, that we're informing them properly, and also the police authority has to take a view that this fits in with our overall strategy, that we're not getting rid of jobs just to save money. There is a direction and purpose behind this. That's why it can take some while. So I do understand the frustrations. In relation to the courts, I understand your frustrations again. Research we did not so long ago suggested to us that less than 10% of officers who are warned for court actually ever are called to give evidence in that court. 1 in 10. That's not a good picture. I have to though pay tribute to the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscals. We are working increasingly with them. They are keen to reduce that to increase the percentage that give evidence, but reduce the numbers who are called unnecessarily. We have seen progress on that, and also working with the Scottish courts, we're also seeing some progress. Naturally, because it affects our budget, we would like it to be quicker. We would like much quicker progress, and even for welfare of officers, it causes untold disruption in terms of shift changes. Childcare is a major issue because not only do they have to pay a lot of money, sometimes they just can't get it at such short notice. And this is raised with us regularly by the Federation. So it's a big issue. It is being looked at by a number of agencies. And in fact, I sit on a group called the Justice Board, which brings together the chief officers of all the component parts of the justice system in Scotland. And we've just been given the authority as the police to chair a number of subgroups. And one of the things that we're looking at will be court attendance and how to reduce the number of officers' hours that's wasted waiting to give evidence.
You mentioned chief officers of the justice system. I take it the judiciary is also involved. It's just as annoying, if I may defend the judiciary, to find that they're sitting and a case can't proceed, a trial can't proceed for a variety of reasons, which we don't need to go into, which most of us know about. Are they involved in this as well, about how...
Not directly, Chair, no, they're not, but the Scottish courts system, the chief executive there does attend. It's chaired by Scottish Government. I'd be perfectly happy for judiciary to be there.
I think it would be, personal views, I think it would be useful, because we know that sheriffs and judges can just as angered by a witness not being available and cases being adjourned and continued and so on as part of it. And they want to see an efficient system too. I think I end up defending the judiciary, but there you go, there's a first for everything. I really do defend them. Now I've got Mr Foley and Mr Rooney both want to come in before Callum Steele. So which of you is coming in? Okay, Mr Foley.
First, Convener, thank you. Just to advise the committee that the authority is very supportive of the extension of the VREA scheme moving forward into subsequent years. And also, the scheme has been successful in a number of areas thus far. The payback period, average payback period for those people who have taken advantage of the scheme is just over 1 year. And that compares very favourably with other public sector exercises. We believe as an authority that it is proof of best value being delivered, which rightly was a criticism made by Audit Scotland in the past.
Callum Steele, were you wanting in, or was that?
I was, Convener, but on the issue of courts, and I think that the Chief Constable started to make reference to it, and it's about the human cost of I hesitate to use the words, but I will, an inefficient court service. And that a a court system which predominantly sits between the hours of 10 o'clock in the morning and 3 o'clock in the afternoon does not sit well with the needs of
We have two former lawyers, advocate and former lawyer. We have four. Don't chisel away an hour there for the sake of dramatic effect.
with an hour and a half off for lunch in between.
Now. I hope you never have to appear in front of the judiciary in a capacity other than as a witness.
Yeah, well, yes. But indeed, the bulk of the work that the police service generally that ends up going before courts usually occurs between the hours of 1800 and 4 o'clock in the morning. Now, the consequence of numerous changes to police officer terms and conditions over the years have not been to address the difficulties associated with having to take police officers off their duties in those hours to attend day shift hours. They've been about making it cheaper, which comes back to the point I was making very early on about how we should be looking to reduce the use of overtime and indeed reduce the changes of shifts that are required to attend and to serve these systems, because in reality, there is generally sufficient notice provided to change shifts, but the human effect of changing shifts is knackering in the extreme. The associated costs of developing and obtaining childcare is particularly difficult. And
that was a word we're allowed to use, but you've used it. Go for it. We all know what it means.
And indeed, even if courts are cancelled, and it has been possible to secure childcare or indeed any other dependent care, because it's not always children that are in play, just because court happens to be cancelled for the individual officer, it is highly unlikely that any private sector provider or indeed local authority provider is going to waive the costs simply because you no longer have to attend at the 11th hour. So there is a phenomenal amount of waste in this particular approach that does need to be addressed, and would save the police service both in human costs and cash costs quite a lot of money.
Yes, I mean, and so on. So I think we accept that something, as they say, has to be done. I'm a history teacher, used to say that, not my arithmetic teacher. You had another question. So, see, I hadn't forgotten.
Thank you very much, Chair. It's excellent. Must be the history teacher, maybe not the arithmetic teacher, whatever it may be. But the point I was trying to make when I asked those two questions, I'm going on to the third question, is that it's not as black and white. It's more of a holistic approach. Obviously for a better police service, and obviously in this area having to save money. And if I could just say, the court doesn't sit to 10:30, convener. They go for lunch between 12:30 and 1:30, and you've got to be back again. But it has slightly improved. They do give you a phone call, etc. But I would really like to see it improved, not just for the judiciary, but for ordinary folk as going as witnesses, as well as police officers also. The other issue I wanted to come on to was... You got that off your chest. I did, and so, I've already said it on many occasions. It's a deployment issue, and I think Callum Steele had touched on it there in regards to overtime. Now, I know in my particular area in Glasgow, at the weekend, we have a special deployment squad that are on until 4 and 5 in the morning. I just wanted to ask, is this part of overtime, or is this an actual deployment squad that go out in the city centre and the hotspots, as you might call it? It's not an overtime, it is an actual squad, and any budget changes wouldn't affect that particular operation.
Thanks very much. What you're referring to is the Glasgow City Centre Plan, which has been up and running for a number of years in various forms. It used to get significant funding from Glasgow City Council, but I think wisely what the council have done in the last 5-6 years is actually fund extra police officers. They put their money into that. The plan is staffed by officers from within Greater Glasgow Division, and we will make very, very little use of overtime. Part of that is because, frankly, common sense and contingency tells you they're going to generate overtime, because it can be a very busy shift. It can be one where, if they're dealing with city centre issues, that they may end up taking someone into custody. That may mean they're going to generate overtime anyway. But we don't routinely run it on overtime, because it's run every Friday, Saturday, Sunday night, and therefore it would be very, very punitive if we did it routinely on overtime. It's mainly done through a variation of shifts, so that officers who are traditionally working a traditional 3 to 11 back shift or afternoon shift will actually come on a bit later and will work through into the earlier hours. Unfortunately for city centres these days in Glasgow and Edinburgh, that means 4 or 5 in the morning, not 1 and 2. Some clubs are only just getting going at 1 and 2 in the morning and don't actually exit people till 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning. So it's quite a sophisticated plan, and we are developing the same response in Edinburgh once we introduce some shift changes in Edinburgh.
Is it only in Glasgow this happens?
Well, there are a variety of plans across the country in city centres, because obviously there's a big increase in nighttime population. And Glasgow, I think, is probably the most sophisticated one. I think simply because it's the largest population. It is a big centre, has a very dense licensing. Edinburgh, I think, is one where we are, well, not I think, we know we are changing some shift patterns to make sure that there are more officers available to deal with nighttime violence. But I should at this point just give my traditional comment. Although I talk about nighttime violence and there is too much of it, violence is reducing in Scotland across the whole country on every division, and alcohol-related violence in pubs and clubs is certainly coming down. What we're suffering from is alcohol-related violence in people's homes.
Colin, sorry.
Thank you.
Colin, to be followed. I beg your pardon, Roderick, to be followed. I beg your pardon. I deleted you.
Yes, well...
I'll sketch you back in.
I shall get my own back on another occasion.
No, you won't. Roderick, followed by Colin, Graham, and then John.
Morning, panel. At the risk of...
I beg your pardon. Your part just now, because Mr Rooney wants to make a comment on the previous one.
Thank you. Yes, if you don't mind, Convener, it was just actually to touch upon and to support the comment that Ms White has made about reform. It's just to provide reassurance to the committee that we don't take decisions in isolation in terms of ER. John has already outlined the process and the robust governance around the HR and Remuneration Committee have a standing item, but we're also involved on an ad hoc basis in terms of the panel itself. So everything that we are determining in terms of individual post holders, it fits into the overall strategy. But it was just to also provide a bit of background in terms of the wider agenda going forward for future years, where, as the Chief Constable has also mentioned, we are actually working towards 14-15 and onwards, and that means actually taking early decisions wherever possible in terms of actual programme moving forward. So we're actually working up our budgets for 14-15. That gets actually processed through a structure in the Police Authority now, which is allowing us to actually get a better understanding of what the cost of policing is going forward. That's perhaps an update from where we were at the last time we appeared before the committee. The important thing to remember, however, is when we were talking about some of the savings that we're mentioning, there is perhaps a timing issue. It's not always the case you can realise the savings in that financial year, so some of what we're talking about will take that bit longer to come through. But to provide reassurance to the committee around that, when you look at what we have achieved in 13-14, we've actually exceeded the target that we had set, and we've done that through actually a range of measures. The original outline business case referred to £41 million. The Chief Constable obviously gave you an indication. In order to be able to achieve the £71 million for the next financial year, we'll have to actually put that programme of reforms in place. And at the forefront of that is actually the Police Authority, making sure that we put in place a range of measures which we will be able to actually agree to and actually allow the Chief Constable then to have the resources we've talked about, perhaps in that last issue around how our cities and towns are policed. So it's important to remember that all these strategies do fit into one overall arching position that we are taking as a police authority, is to make sure that we have the best possible police service.
Roderick, sorry.
Thank you. At the risk of further confusion, I just wanted to refer to the pie chart on page 4 of the SPA and Police Scotland's submission. That shows for 2013-14 net savings, of which people 39 million, 61%. In terms of 2014-15 and 2015-16, what kind of figure are we kind of anticipating as a percentage for people savings? Or
I don't think we're in a position at the moment to say what we think the exact percentage will be going forward. I think earlier answers to questions have made it pretty clear. We'll be looking for a substantial amount of savings to come from support staff voluntary redundancy. But also, I think, as we go further ahead, I'm picking up on what Councillor Rooney has suggested, we'll also see the strategy kick in more in relation to savings around property, around procurement, because I think members will appreciate these things take things take a little bit longer. Although I've said that the VR/ER can take 6 months to exit an individual from the organisation, even if they want to leave the organisation, getting out of some building leases, selling buildings that we no longer need, introducing I6, rationalising the number of control rooms that we have and putting everybody onto a single command and control platform for the whole country, that will take longer. So I would be hopeful that we would, over time, see the percentage associated with people start to reduce as other percentages or proportions increase. But I think that takes a bit longer to come on stream.
The number of women taking VR/ER is rather higher than the number of men. Does that cause any concerns?
We are monitoring it, but our workforce is in the majority female from support staff, not male. Therefore, we would expect to see more women taking VR/ER than men in total numbers. What we're looking at is the relationship between the two proportions. But again, much of the process is a voluntary scheme. I mean, I think it's important to mention perhaps that we do have a redeployment pool. So if we put forward, and an example is one that's been raised by Unison, I think, in the submission, but also we've talked about it a couple of times, is the citation servers. What we've done there is say, actually, as a class of a job, we think that we can, we don't need that class of a job, which means that the people there are therefore, their employment in that job has gone. Those that want to take VR and ER can leave the organisation with a decent package. Those who want to stay will go into a redeployment pool, which is funded from police reform, and we will look to find them alternative employment within the organisation. So the proportion of people going is, to an extent, based on partly what jobs we're looking at, but also individual choice.
Yes.
It's also worth noting that in those figures, in relation to gender balance, that there are more females who have gone that were part-time workers. So these are whole numbers that you're looking at. So there's an influence over the statistics there because of part-time working.
Could you run that past me again? Sorry, Mr. Foley. What's the figure? What's the full-time equivalent then?
I don't have the full-time equivalent in front of me.
Right. Mr. MacLeod.
Convener, just for some additional clarity, the gender balance in the force at the moment is about 60% female, 40% male. Of those VR/ER applications that have been approved, the balance is about 69% female, 31% male. We are about halfway through that whole VR/ER process for this year. The expectation is that the actual balance will begin to fall more in line with the actual starting position of the overall force, the 60-40 split. So while there is a difference at the moment, it's not one that is unexpected, given the areas that are being supported at the moment. And we believe as we go through the year, that balance will come more into line with what would be expected.
Yeah, perhaps, Convener, I should have waited for the question. That would have fit in very nicely to the point I was making a few moments ago. I was just to actually say that this is obviously something that we are raising as an HR committee. It's not something that we have got concerns at this present time, but it's part of the monitoring reports that we receive, Mr Campbell, and it's certainly something that we will be continuing to monitoring and asking the Chief Constable about.
In 2012, Audit Scotland said that police authorities had not played an effective role in scrutinising equality or environmental issues. What's the SPA doing about that at the current time in the new setup?
Yes, Mr Foley.
The authority has set up a number of committees that have been referred to in relation to dealing with equality. HR committee is the overarching one, and there's a number of sub-committees formed from that as well. The membership of the HR committee comprises mainly colleagues from Police Scotland, chaired by a member of the authority. There are several other members who form part of that committee as well. We have regular reporting, which has improved and is improving. PSOS colleagues actively participate within the committee, and performance is monitored on a regular basis.
Does that have any particular impact on the budget?
In terms of equality?
Well, just in terms of making these plans and the committees, where does that feature in the budget?
Sorry, I couldn't.
Well, if you're making these plans to try and kind of monitor that, is it reflected anywhere? Has it got a spending aspect to it, really? That's what I'm coming to.
Not a spending aspect specifically, because the staffing's already there to take account of it, and it's done through standard members' time.
Sorry, I beg your pardon, Mr. Rooney.
Just to add on to John's comments, as is mentioned, the HR committee obviously monitor this as part of their standing orders, part of their responsibilities, but just reassure the member that in respect of every decision that we are taking, equalities are considered. However, I would say it's very early stages of the organisation. Part of what we are doing just now is actually meeting with staff associations, as we did in the week, to actually get a bit more of their views in terms of how we can actually move forward to ensure that there is improvement in this area, because I do acknowledge the Audit Scotland report, and that's obviously key in terms of what the SPA is trying to achieve.
Thank you. Colin?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, and good morning. I think my question's really turned into a supplementary here, but it's, yeah, well, I wonder sometimes. The question's really based around the amount of women who are leaving the service, and certainly there are some possible reforms that will come in, particularly in the Victims and Witnesses bill that's going through, in terms of who should be trying to deal with certain people, and it's better that it's perhaps a female to be involved. Are there any budgetary implications in the operation of any of these possible reforms should they be brought in?
Well, I mean, I would anticipate, not in all cases, but in most cases, that under the Victim and Witnesses Act, when we're talking about women police officers providing support to victims and witnesses, and what the figures we've been talking about obviously have been civilian staff.
Yeah, I was thinking just obviously with the reforms, is there a possibility that it's not just uniformed warranted staff who would be doing some of these jobs, shall we say? And it was just if we are in a position where a lot of women are leaving the service as a whole, talk about civilian and uniformed, do we run into trouble with this?
Sorry, I understand the thrust of the question. I don't think that is a particular concern at this moment in time. As I say, in the main, it would be women police officers who would provide that sort of support, because we'd be talking about people who would be doing the interviewing, and although one legacy force did have an experiment around civilian interviewers, that has been left behind. Really, I don't think it proved to be as effective as had been hoped. So we're really talking about police officers providing specific support. When it comes to providing longer-term support to victims and witnesses, that's where we really we would expect, and we would turn to our partners across the country to provide that sort of long-term support. I met last week with Victim Scotland, Victim Support Scotland, and I think you're hearing from them later, perhaps. So we would look to them and are talking with them about that sort of strategic partnership. The same with Assist, who provide long-term support to victims of domestic abuse, and a number of agencies that provide support to victims of sexual assault. We'd be looking to our partners to provide that, because the role of police officers, and indeed in the police service, is to provide some immediate support and stabilisation to victims. But it's not to continue that long-term support to victims. That has to fall to other agencies.
So, it was just for clarity and to ask the question.
Come in here.
Yes, indeed. Convener, and it's not specific to the issue of the Victim and Witnesses Bill, but it is specific to the potential dangers that shrinking budgets create for the equality makeup of any service, but specifically the police service. I know from looking south of the border that at this moment in time, because of the financial constraints that the police service in England and Wales is facing, that the opportunities for part-time and flexible working are reduced significantly, principally because of the desire to make sure that there are as many police officers available at times that wholly suit the police service and not necessarily take cognizance of the requirements of working mothers, principally, and officers with additional caring responsibilities. And that has seen the number of part-time officers in England and Wales reduced quite significantly. And although the data that is being gathered to examine that has not been forensically examined to see to what extent that has had a marked reduction, but the observations at this moment in time are that as a consequence of financial challenges, the opportunities for part-time and flexible working in the police service in England and Wales are being reduced significantly and making it more likely that female police officers will leave the service. Now, obviously, Scotland is a number of years behind where England and Wales is with the financial challenges of policing that it has got. But one thing that we will be doing very closely is we will be working with the Chief Constable and indeed his HR team to make sure that what is quite a restrictive approach to flexible and part-time working is not replicated north of the border as a consequence of responding to the financial challenges.
And Stephen House, are you receptive to that?
I am, Chair, and that's partly what I wanted to say. I mean, we would be very keen to do that. We're seeing up to about 35% of our new applicants are women. I personally see no reason why that shouldn't be 50%, 51%. It would be entirely appropriate if it was. I just wanted to just unusually challenge something that Callum said, because he said he thinks that Scotland is some years behind where England and Wales is in terms of the financial challenge. I don't think we're on the same trajectory, personally, as England and Wales in terms of the financial challenge, or indeed many other policing issues. I think we're on a different path, and I think the path we are on, frankly, is a better path that allows us a better development of policing in this country.
I've got two, if you're desperate, Graham and John, to ask extra questions, I'm going to take the two together so I can finish at a reasonable time for the next panel. So I'll just take each of your questions and you can, what's your question, Graham?
It's a couple of clear-up questions, in fact. I think it would be remiss not to ask the authority about the pensions issue within the budget, and the numbers within the, and I declare an interest as someone who benefits from a previous life in the service through pension. But the budget figures show a rise from 291 million to a projected 346 million by 2015-16. What is the impact of that on your plans in terms of Police Scotland? And do you have any options for the years ahead to deal with the rise in the figures for the future?
That's one. And what's your one, John?
I would like to ask about devolved resource management. The forces all had different levels of devolved resource management, and the linkage that there could be for budget scrutiny connected with devolvement to take account of local policing plans, ideally even down to ward level. I know that's a long term, and I know that the arrangements are in transition, but any comment on that? Because as a supporter of single force, I'm not a supporter of the centralisation aspect, I'm a supporter of the economy of scale aspect. And I think that the local policing element could be picked up with the sufficient devolvement of
Good question,
resources.
but a big question. So perhaps we've got pensions and we've got devolved financial management. Could we have answers to those, please, Mr MacLeod?
Yes. Convener. Firstly, on the pensions one, that inevitable increase is a direct result of the increasing number of pensioners. Fortunately for the Police Authority, the cost of police pensions is picked up by the Justice Department as a whole, so it forms part of the overall budget allocation to the Justice Department. In effect, the Scottish Government is picking up that cost, and it's not a direct cost against the Police Authority or Police Scotland.
And
secondly, in
oh,
relation...
so sorry. No, you're on a roll. Go for it.
Indeed. Convener, the default position would always be to devolve as much of the budget down to that lowest level of accountability that we can, and I'm a very strong supporter of that. The situation, though, is in order to achieve the savings both this year and probably going forward for the next couple of years, it's important that the centre has that direct control over the big cost drivers. And that's why, at the moment, most of the budget is being held centrally. But that is just a temporary situation. I would very much support your view of how the budget should operate. And certainly I would look forward to much more of the budget being devolved down to that lowest level in the future.
Stephen House, then Callum Steele, and then Paul Rooney, all on this.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I mean, your ambition, Mr Finney, is my ambition in relation to that, and the description you gave of actually you're in favour of a single service for economy of scale, not centralisation. I would agree with much of that as well. My ambition would be exactly as Alan has said, would be to push as much as we possibly can down to local level, even if it's possible with the administration to ward level. But the worst thing you can, from personal experience, you can possibly do is give somebody a devolved budget and say, but you have no control over it whatsoever, because actually all these costs are fixed in terms of a variety of things. The only thing you've really got any say over is overtime, and we do devolve that down quite a long way already. But the ambition is correct, because that matches how far down we've already devolved the creation of policing plans and prioritisation. We have 353 ward plans, as you know, and it would be great to have 353 budgets at ward level as well, to let people actually locally spend the money on the kind of policing that they want. That's an ambition that we would like to pursue. But Alan's explained why at the moment it would be an unfair thing to do, I feel.
Yes.
A very quick answer, and I'm sure Mr Graham and indeed Mr Finney will take, sorry, Mr Pearson and Mr Graham will take, I'll forget it, you know what I mean. We'll take considerable comfort.
Someone's listening out there somewhere.
We'll take some.
In any me.
Yeah, but we'll take some comfort from the answer, and that is that over the past 2 years, police officers have paid an extra £16 million in Scotland into their police pensions, or certainly into the police pensions of those that have retired. And there's no additional benefit in terms of value to the police pensions of those police officers that have made those contributions. And it is highly likely that as a consequence of increases that are almost certainly going to be coming in next year, that we will make yet another £4 million on top of that in direct contributions on our pensions. So even though there is no tangible benefit for those in service, as a consequence of across the public sector increases to public sector pensions, police officers will have, by the time 2015-16 comes around, will have paid an extra £20 million into their pensions in Scotland alone.
Now have that in the record, Mr Rooney.
Just to touch upon the resource management point, it certainly is an ambition that we would like to support. Obviously, you've heard this morning in evidence that we're some way off being able to actually take a zero-based approach, but that's certainly the work that the Finance Investment Committee is tasked with doing, to actually get an understanding of the cost. Once you're in that position, Mr Finney, then you can actually look and see how you can devolve the budgets further. However, I have to concur with the comments already been said. The police service, in the main, as a public body, does devolve down to as low a level as possible. What we are aiming to do is to go further.
Yes, Mr Conn.
Just a final point. Probably understand where John is coming from. As a commander in the North, I did have a substantial budget, and I think it's important as we roll forward that those that are responsible for the operational decisions within divisions are also responsible for the financial decisions, and that allows local environment to take place. And if staff vacancies are being carried in local policing, then the commanders can use that money, providing they meet their policing priorities, come in on budget. I think it gives that flexibility, and as we roll forward, it's something we will certainly be pushing for.
And a final point, which we've not been asked, is, and I'm aware that we've got victim support next, so I'm looking at the implementation of this new idea, as it were, of a joint protocol between the Crown Office and Police Scotland in relation to domestic abuse cases, in certain very specific cases, perhaps, I say this to Stephen Housden, being the perpetrator being diverted into counselling rather than into a court process, or and so on. Now, parking the merits of what, obviously it's an area that is sensitive and will be and should be. But what are the financial implications if one's looking at that? I'm not suggesting for 1 minute you're suggesting it to save money, but are there financial implications of counselling as opposed to the court process?
Well, Chair, thank you for raising the question. I want to be very clear on what I suggested, and I'm pretty clear I was clear the first time round, which was I don't think anyone, or I don't take a back seat to anyone in policing in terms of focus on domestic abuse. And I've been very clear in my 6 years in Scotland that our role is to focus on the offenders of domestic abuse and make sure that they face justice in whatever shape or form that presents itself, because what they're doing is committing crimes, and therefore they must face justice. So what I was suggesting was actually a subset of what you're saying, that sometimes prison is not the best or the only answer for offenders in relation to domestic abuse. I don't think what I said was particularly controversial. All I'm saying is that officers attend a domestic abuse incident. They do what they do now, which is take positive action. Where they can find evidence of a crime, they make sure that they detain somebody for that crime, and they investigate and they support the victim. The offender then goes into the criminal justice system, which is correct. All I was suggesting was it may be appropriate for some offenders that they don't go to prison. And the examples I'm thinking of are where actually this is an ongoing and viable relationship, but that an offender has a particular issue that needs to be dealt with. Is that issue going to be solved by him going to prison for a period of time? Possibly not. Does the victim want that to happen? Possibly not. It may be that the offender is earning a wage which supports the family. What happens then if he goes to prison? Stereotypically, it would be a he in 85% of cases at least. What happens when he goes to prison? So my point was one of some flexibility for a number of cases properly assessed, to say there's a diversionary activity here, but the idea or concept that they go off and do finger painting or something like that, as some of the media seem to be thinking I was suggesting, was nonsense. And I think anyone who knows me knows I don't take a particularly soft option on these things. I think sometimes people, actually the easier option is the traditional punishment. A more difficult option is for someone to be sitting down and faced with what they've done, who they've done it to, and what their motivation is, and be challenged to try and deal with that. I don't want to sound as though I'm soft on these things, so I don't think I am. There would be a financial impact, but again, we would be looking to work with our partners on these sort of issues, and there are a number of partners out there. And I would, outside of the domestic abuse, for example, we work very closely with a group called Includum, who work with the very high-end, high-tariff gang offenders and challenge them and their behaviour. Now, Includum is a partner we work with, and of course, as with all voluntary sector partners, they're keen to get funding, and we're keen to help them get funding. That would be a new challenge. But I think, for me, it was a proposal to say, is there something that could be done here? Could we look at some alternatives? The reality, of course, is not every domestic abuse offender does go anywhere near prison, and that's partly because there aren't enough prison spaces for domestic abuse offenders in Scotland. It would simply swamp the system. We have to be thinking what are viable alternatives to this that actually might be more challenging for the offender and might help the victim a bit more.
Can I say I don't disagree with you? I wanted you to be able to put that on the record, because I think that it's important to say it's not a soft option. It's certainly not for everybody, but I think it's interesting to have that put on the record. Can I thank you all for your evidence this morning? If there's anything additionally that you wish to say, don't say it now, because we're going to have a break. But if you would put it in writing to me as chair in the committee, share it with the committee, and it be in the public domain. Thank you very much, and I'm going to let you have a 10-minute break. There we are, panel 2, and back we are. And can I thank the panel members that are in front of us, because I think we sat through, I think, the previous session, and didn't even get a cup of tea, which was very remiss of us. Anyway, we have before us, it's on the budget of the Crown Office and the Procurator Fiscal Service, including its commitment to implement a protocol on handling domestic abuse cases, which, as you know, I just raised at the end of the meeting. And I welcome the meeting Catherine Dyer, Crown Agent and Chief Executive of the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, Anne-Marie Hicks, Procurator Fiscal Service for Domestic Abuse, and Alan McCloskey. Is it McCloskey? McCloskey, Acting Deputy Chief Executive of Victim Support Scotland. Can I thank you all also for your written submissions and questions, please? Colin Keir, what a surprise. Followed by Roderick. Followed by Sandra. I'm doing reverse order this time. Colin.
It's nice to be seen by the convener every now and again. It's really it's the obvious one about the Crown Office priorities for 14-15, and how do you think this will be reflected in your spending?
Well, I have to say our priorities really haven't changed from sort of the previous priorities that we set out. So we had sort of 9 priorities. Domestic abuse was obviously one of them, and I know the committee will probably want to ask more about that. Obviously, our fatalities investigation, hate crime, knife crime, proceeds of crime, serious and organised crime, sexual crime, homicides and violent crime. And really, in essence, we've been sort of planning on the basis that this was an expectation in the public sector, what this was going to look like. And we've repositioned ourselves. I think the last time the evidence was given committee in the budget last year, it was explained about how we had restructured Crown Office and the Fiscal Service very much in mind about what was going to happen with the single police force and with the courts. And really, we've gone through that, and the purpose of that was to make sure that we were in a position to be able to carry on with the commitments that we have.
Has there been any,
No, go.
have there been any budgetary constraints then on you following these, given that we're in a tight,
obviously, I think
tight economy?
The Crown Office and the Fiscal Service is the same as any of the other public sector organisations. It's a challenge for us that we have to sort of deal with in terms of delivering the service that we require to deliver against a very tight budget. Really just in the same position as no doubt other people have been saying to you. The purpose of that is really to try and plan, but we do not see that there would be an impact in terms of level of service. We intend to be that we're sort of moving resource around and sort of making use of technology, etc., to free up resource so that we can deliver the commitments that we've given.
Resource around, what does that mean?
Well, in terms of our restructure, what we did was we obviously moved, I think, from 11 areas and a network of local fiscal offices to the 3 federations that we have. Now, the police, we moved to that first, and the police, thankfully, looked at what we'd done and agreed in terms of the scale that we were going for, that met sort of the needs in terms of service delivery against the type of crime that we saw in each of these parts of the world. And we also then moved to functional working, as we call it, where our lawyers and our support staff are split into actual types of the core work that we do. So there are people who are specialists in a particular type of crime, and obviously Anne-Marie's an example of that in terms of people that do carry out domestic abuse investigation and prosecution. But we also have people who are preparing particular types of offences, because obviously the court service means that we are split into summary court proceedings, sheriff and jury court proceedings and high court proceedings. So the model that we had before was really that there were sort of jacks of all trade, if you like. What we've done now is have that each of the staff are in a sort of specialised slice of that work, and that's allowing us to be that we've got people that are very specialised at what they're doing, and as we decide that we need to perhaps absorb a new type of crime or a new, in terms of victims and witnesses legislation coming in, then we are able to sort of see what resource we've got and move appropriately. And I think the thing for us is that the specialism that we're able to bring now with the way that we're organised means that we've actually increased the capacity, if you like, of the organisation.
Yes.
You're obviously looking forward as to how to react, and it's interesting. Obviously, we have an interest to the highlight, I suppose. I dread to sort of say it in that way, but the issue of the likes of corroboration, and should that be our views on corroboration, that the laws should be changed, how reactive and what kind of effect could it have in budgetary terms to your organisation?
Well, as the convener sort of indicated previously, obviously a lot of work went into the financial memorandum going along with the bill, and Crown Office and the Fiscal Service contributed to that too, and have worked quite closely, obviously, with the police and the court service to talk about what the impact might be. And the figures are sort of given in terms of the work that was done in the Carloway report, and then as that's been refined through what was put into the financial memorandum. So we're anticipating that obviously there will be a slight increase in terms of the number of cases that we would expect to see going to court, but we are planning to be able to sort of cope with that. That's the purpose of it. And I suppose this is where it's helpful about knowing the legislation, and at the same time I suppose we're always constantly changing. I mean, I think now in the justice arena, if you like, that's the position we're always going to be, that we're having to sort of look forward and try and anticipate what we're doing. But in terms of where we are at the moment, we've done a lot of work in terms of sort of shadow marking exercises, etc., to see what we think is likely to be the type of case that perhaps we weren't able to bring to court before if this goes ahead, and what that will mean in terms of numbers, and we are planning to be able to cope with that.
It was just any particular difficulties you're having in putting these things into practice was really what I was trying to get to.
I don't, at the moment, no. Obviously, the position is that until it actually comes into being, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating, as it were. But the planning is to get us to that stage, if that's what happens.
In your planning, and it's across, let's just keep to changes in corroboration, but I'm not going into what merits and otherwise, just say we get rid of it. You say a slight increase. Now, you're having a forward plan. What's your percentage increase, you reckon, in cases to the sheriff and jury and High Court? Have you?
It's between parameters, and again, we gave that evidence. And so, in terms of numbers, I think the reality of it is, I suppose, from the justice system point of view, till it comes through the door, if you like, till it's reported to the police, it's difficult for us to do that. So what we've done is gone back and looked with the police at cases where they didn't report it to us because they didn't think that there was a sufficiency, or where we have had things reported to us that actually, when we've analysed it and done the further investigation, decided that it wasn't sufficiency, and these are the ones that we've sort of looked at. So in terms of the percentages, it's set out in the financial memorandum what we anticipate, and I think we also have provided letters to this committee and to other committees in terms of what we anticipate, but we're not talking about floodgates, we're talking about a small percentage really increase. Well, in terms, I think my colleague would say, we think that we've got around 1% in the summary and around 6% in the solemn cases. So that's sheriff and jury, as opposed to summaries, the 1% that would be before a court where it was a sheriff or a justice of the peace.
Figures, what would that represent? Sorry to be difficult, but just what
oh, my arithmetic's not good, but we get reported
you
at the moment.
You didn't have Ms Campbell as well for arithmetic, did you?
No, probably.
No.
But we get around 280,000 cases a year at the moment are reported to us. And in terms of ones that go across into the court, we're roughly sitting about between 4,000 and 5,000 sheriff and jury cases, between about 600 High Court cases, and so it's the percentages based on that.
Out later, that's my homework. Thank you very much. It gives an idea, looking from the financial impact on just your business, let alone the court itself. Colin. Roderick, Sandra, John Finney and Margaret Mitchell.
Yeah. Before I move on to my questions, when I asked Lord Carloway about the impact of the abolition of the requirement for corroboration, given the new prosecutorial tests, he said, I asked him specifically, it's not necessarily the case that more cases would come to trial. He said absolutely he agreed with that. So I'm obviously interested in your view that more cases will actually reach court.
I think based on what we saw in terms of the shadow market, and I suppose this is what I'm trying to say, in terms of we were looking backwards at cases that had already been reported to us. Really, until we see what is reported to us, we're not going to be in a position. So this was an attempt to say, in the scenario of what we would expect comes through the door at the moment, if other cases that were not able to be put into court, but with the new prosecutorial test and the new legal position, if we applied that, what were the percentage increases? And that's where we've got to in terms of that.
And you said also that you'd written to the committee with some information on this. I don't recall seeing that. But
just written submission. It's in the written
submission. Okay. Could I just move on to the question of the impact of the reorganisation into 3 geographical federations and also a more specialist unit doing domestic abuse and serious sexual offences. Could you just kind of outline what impact that's had in financial terms? What savings have been achieved by that reorganisation?
Obviously, the position is that the budget went down significantly from a sort of top line in the sort of best year of 2009-10 of about 119 million to 100 million. And that has meant that we had to sort of make some decisions in terms of, as Mr House was saying in the previous session, the staffing levels that we have and what we can do. So we've had some early exits from the organisation, again in the position of no compulsory redundancies. That meant that we had to sort of look at how we were configured. And what we've done is maintained the level of business, obviously, that we had, and in fact dealt with increased levels of business with fewer staff. And that's on the basis that, as with other public sector organisations, what we're looking to try to be is as efficient as possible as we deal with the work that comes in through the door.
You couldn't actually quantify those savings. It's just working within a reduced budget is what you're really...
I think that is obviously quite considerable sort of savings. And in terms of what we've done with that, we obviously have in some areas, because you talked about domestic abuse, we have a number of staff across the organisation who've been specially trained in relation to domestic abuse in two particular locations in Edinburgh and Glasgow. There are actually specialist courts, and obviously we continue to sort of fund these, and these are dealing with much greater numbers of cases over the last few years than when they were originally instigated.
In terms of recruitment going forward, is it still a position that trainee procurator fiscals are not offered or have no prospect of employment at the end of their training period?
It was never the position that they had no prospect of employment. The position is that we've had originally, in terms of the Cabinet Office rules about civil service as a whole, there were some freezes on recruitment altogether, and at that point we didn't recruit any further permanent legal staff. But last year we recruited further permanent legal staff, and we've just gone through another recruitment round. And the position is that a number of the people that applied for these posts were former trainees. In addition, throughout the period, we've actually always had a number of posts, either fixed term or fixed term on fair and open recruitment. And again, a number of the people that have applied for these posts and been successful have been former Crown Office trainees. I think sometimes the headlines look as if there's sort of no hope, and that just isn't the position at all. There are quite a number of them. We obviously find that the trainees are a very good, usually the brightest and best that we attract from the universities, and it's important that we obviously give them a good training, and when we've done that, then it is likely that if we have post to offer, they're going to be well positioned to take up that offer.
Thank you. Convener, I'll let somebody else come in now.
I just want, because you're on staffing, do we have a note of the staffing levels in Crown Office at various levels? Do we have a note of that? It would be on a website, will it?
We do have, and certainly if you don't have it, we can certainly send it to you.
Because certainly what I hear from advocates and so on is that the Crown Office is, far too much work and not enough trained staff to deal with it.
I'm not sure which advocates they might be.
I'm not naming and shaming them. I'm just putting it to you. Has there been a decrease in staffing?
Oh yes, I mean that's what I said to you.
Given that we're going to have more cases coming to you and there's more burdens on victims and witnesses, surely we should be looking at more staffing.
Well, I think the position is that we keep that under careful review, and what we do is always sort of make the decisions about, now that we're able to recruit again, then obviously the position is that we will adjust staffing as required for that. Equally well, to some extent, we've got to see what is coming in. Again, in terms of what happens with Crown Office and the Fiscal Service, there is some leeway, certainly with the more serious cases, in terms of when they're reported and when we would expect to have them in court. We also use a number of investigators, assistants and precognition officers who assist with the preparation of that. So I think at the moment we're fairly comfortable that what we've got in terms of legal staff, which is what I think you were probably talking about, we've certainly been able to recruit additional permanent legal staff, and that we would keep that under review and look to see if we do need to do more of that. Now, obviously, that's where it comes into about looking where you bring the resource from that for.
But in terms of if it goes more efficiently through your offices, then there's less delay in other parts of the justice system and saving, not necessarily, but there's the opportunity in court time and in police time and everything, if cases are prepared and come to court with full preparation more quickly, surely.
Well, I think the issue is that they are fairly quickly prepared in terms of what Scotland's like compared with any of the other sort of jurisdictions that are near to us. You'll be aware of the very tight timescales that we have in terms of custody cases, whether it's at summary or at Sheriff and Jury or High Court, but also Crown Office and the Fiscal Service actually sort of contributes to the overarching target of 26 weeks for summary cases, from caution and charge to actual disposal across the justice system, and that's been well exceeded at the moment. I'd have to say, in listening to the last session, it was interesting. I mean, part of the reason that we have witnesses and police officers hanging around courts is the number of cases that don't actually plead. I mean, in terms of cases that we need to actually bring witnesses into the courtroom and have their evidence heard on oath, that's actually just around the 5% mark. So that indicates to us that there's something, and I think we're working quite hard together on the Justice Board, where, again, the Chief Constable spoke about that in terms of who's sitting around that table, to sort of work about what is it that happens in courts that means that we end up, that we don't have cases pleading as early as they should be.
Judiciary should be on that committee.
As I understand, the position is we've got in the work that we do, we've got the Making Justice Work programme, and I think the judiciary are involved in that in terms of that they are observers and assist, but they don't want to become members, if you like, of the grouping. And I think that's probably quite correct in terms, I think we want to be careful about where we need to have the independencies within the sort of justice system, but equally well sitting as the prosecutor who needs to be independent to a percentage, then, or to a point, then the situation is we still want to collaborate together if there are things that we can look at and sort of come up with solutions. And certainly domestic abuse is one of the ones where there's an example of that, where the judiciary is very much involved in taking forward what the courts should operate like and how they should run and what should be expected of the Crown and the defence in situations like that. And I think that's quite appropriate.
Sandra, followed by John Finney. Sandra.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you, convener. You did touch on the issue I was going to raise, I'd raised earlier on about the churn, and you know exactly what the Crown Office was doing to alleviate or stop the churn, as I must say. And I must pay tribute to Victim Support Scotland for their volunteers who are there speaking to people as they're waiting. And I don't know, maybe my particular experience was particularly bad, but it's still not resolved, and that's not just me but other witnesses also. So I just wondered, if you could outline the steps that you're taking with the churn, and basically, would there be cost savings once this has been, put through, such as not having so many cases, witnesses waiting, that type of thing?
I mean, obviously, there's a concern. The Crown suffers from the cost of this as well, because obviously that's using some of the resource that I'm talking about that we would like to move on to other things if things are repeatedly prepared for court. We also have to pay witness expenses for the civilian witnesses if they're called to court, whether or not they give evidence. So we've got a particular interest in that. But the overriding interest is, as we talk often to victim support, about what the experience is of victims and witnesses going through the system. But in terms of what we're doing to reduce churn, again, I think it's interesting. We've come to collective view, I think, in Scotland, that it is about a criminal justice system. It's not just about the individual organisations within it. And while Crown Office and the Fiscal Service is obviously the focus, because they're the people that are deciding what should go into a court and they're deciding which Crown witnesses should come to court, they're not necessarily responsible for the whole of things that happen at court. And we've worked very closely with the Making Justice Work programme, with the police and Scottish courts, the Scottish Legal Aid Board, etc., to look at what are the different influences that you get around a court case. And just now there's actually some pilot work going on, or initiatives, I suppose, one of which has just started up in Aberdeen, where there's already been sort of significant improvement in terms of the number of cases not being adjourned but going to trial or pleading at the point. And obviously I think all the work that we're doing across the Making Justice Work programme is trying to get that we get the pleas of guilty at as early a stage as possible, if that's what's going to happen with the case. I mean, you're always quite legitimately going to have people that are saying that they didn't do it and they want to go to trial. But actually, when you look at it as a whole, a very great number of the cases, the witnesses are repeatedly cited, and then it's 2 or 3 times down the road that the person actually pleads guilty. And it's what can we do to encourage that we're getting that. So that work is going on and is actually going out to some of the other courts because it looks as if it's going to be quite successful, and that would reduce churn. We've also done a lot in terms of the thought that it's because the Crown's not prepared. I don't think that is the position now, because certainly one of the things that we struggled with when disclosure of the evidence being handed over to the defence in a sort of bundle, if you like, came on board was that was as a result of an overnight decision in a court case, and although we'd been working towards it, we weren't ready for it. The police and ourselves were not ready for that. Over the year, what we've done is we've now got our disclosure website where everything is electronically downloaded by the defence agent. As soon as we put it on, they can download it. We've got it timed to the second, and that has been quite interesting an experience for us, because really it's allowed that we can show the court that everything has been disclosed. And the defence obviously have to accept it. They've got their printout showing what was disclosed. And it's things like that I think we really need to work on, where we are thinking about what would assist the defence to be as ready when we are ready, and that's what we're doing with that.
Just follow up with a small question, Chair. It probably won't be able to do that, it might be too difficult, but you're looking at the project. Do you have percentages and numbers of cases that are repeatedly called, i.e. by either saying 1 minute they're guilty and then the lawyer pleads that there's a technicality or whatever it may be? Do you have actual evidence of numbers?
Scottish Court Service keeps all of these records, and actually I think these are published as well, I think, in terms of the justice statistics, so they are all available. And in terms of what's been happening in the Aberdeen project that I talked about, there was a quite significant drop in that over a very small space of time when they compared what had happened in the months before to what was happening now, so that I think it went down to, instead of around 45% of the cases being adjourned, it went down to 23%, and their aim is to really try and make it that it's actually that the cases we have in court on a day for trial are cases that are going to trial. We don't expect anything else to happen to them.
I may get that information, Chair. I can get it myself anyway.
That's Spice provided.
That would be very interesting for it. Could I just ask one last question in regards to obviously the...
You always say it in such a plaintive fashion.
Yes,
never refuse.
I'm a very plaintive person. What I wanted to ask was in cost implications. Obviously, you're looking at a churn, you're doing a pilot project. Have you been asked to cost save in doing this exercise? Is it limited, or during the budget?
When they do all these things, they sort of make a sort of business case, if you like, and they sort of estimate what they'll do. So there will be costings around that particular one. But this is really a sort of joint effort, if you like, between Scottish Court, the police, Scottish Courts and ourselves, to try and sort of make sure that we've got everything lined up so that the conditions are the best that they can be, for us to be absolutely clear from the start with the defence about what it is that we expect will go to trial and what is likely to be pleading, and so avoiding inconvenience and distress to sort of witnesses and victims.
Sorry, did you say when you would be reporting on that, or whether that report and the findings would be available? Would it be publicly available to see what we've learned?
I mean, at the end of the day, they're publicly available anyway, because Scottish Courts, I think, issues the statistics, so it's able to be seen court by court what the position is. And at the moment, there's a project with the 7 biggest courts in Scotland where there's been a number of moves over the past few years to try and make the conditions such that we're sort of changing things as a point at a time. And the culmination of that really was then the decision to sort of put everything that was working into the Aberdeen court and to see if that made a significant difference. And I think we've got to sort of say that it's also predicated on some of the behaviour of the police in reporting to us. And in Aberdeen, there's particular things where they've been having body-worn cameras, and we've got an arrangement where, for instance, in domestic abuse incidents, the evidence from the body-worn camera and perhaps the 999 call are given to the Procurator Fiscal at the same time as the custody report is being received. And that allows us then to show that to the defence agent, who can then go and speak to his client, and we can sort of see what's happening with that. So it's all that kind of approach to things.
And is that all going to be in writing somewhere? Is
Yes.
what I'm getting at. So
Yes.
you're telling us this, but we're quite interesting.
In terms of evaluation,
analysis and evaluation.
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. John Finney, followed by Margaret Mitchell.
Thank you, Convener. I've got a number of questions, if I may, for each of the witnesses. Ms Dyer, if I noted you correctly, you talked about increased capacity of the organisation. Yes. Was that subsequent to the reorganisation?
Yes.
And is it your view that that would cover your telephone communication systems?
We have what we call an inquiry point, and again, I'm quite happy to provide the committee with what we have in terms of the numbers of calls that we receive and also the number of times that people have to wait. And we try and do that in terms of what industry standards are for all contact centres, so yes.
And I mean, I'm a member of the public as well as dealing with constituents' issues too. And it's certainly personal experience and experience of my staff that your telephone system isn't particularly good. If I phone someone in Inverness, for instance, where is the phone answered?
It's in, well, it depends.
Dumbarton, is it?
It can be Dumbarton, or there are other places around the country. But that really should not make a difference to it in terms of we have a number of direct lines where it's people who are going to be in touch with us on a regular basis, and the contact point is if you don't know who you're going to be in touch with, then you would be able to go through the contact point, the inquiry point.
And I mean, we heard from Mr House in the previous session there about the 101 number. Mm-hmm. And I presume it's the same philosophy that applies with
yeah. Yes.
Are there shortfalls in the system, technical shortfalls that could be addressed by way of the budget?
I don't think there are shortfalls in the system, but again, happy to sort of provide the information that we have, and that's obviously something that the committee can look at. But I don't think that there are shortfalls in the system.
Okay. Similarly, does the Crown Office Procurator Fiscal Service operate a document tracking system for communications?
In terms of what?
Well, even simply logging information that comes in.
We do have, again, depending what kind of information it is that comes in, everything that comes in from the police or other reporting agencies is dealt with electronically. It comes in electronically to us, so we have that logging system.
Letters from elected representatives?
There should be. There's something called Respond, but again, is there human intervention in that? Yes, there is. So I'm not saying that it's perfect all the time.
I worked with the fourth recorded delivery one, I have to say. Can I ask, in relation to a statement that was made by Sheriff Bowen on the relatively inexperienced prosecutors, how is that being addressed? Are there budgetary issues around that? And do you have, for instance, a succession planning policy?
We do have a succession planning policy in terms of that we look to see what kind of experience levels we have of staff. Now, actually, a sort of, I suppose, perverse outcome of the fact that there was not an ability to recruit at the beginning of the financial downturn is actually that the people that we have with us now are all much more experienced than they were at the beginning of that. And also the fact is that the people that we've recruited lately, either last year or this year, have tended to be people that have worked with us before on fixed-term contracts. So they have had a deal of experience, and most of them have been Crown Office trainees. So, I mean, certainly, I think Sheriff Principal Bowen was reporting what was the position probably in terms of outcomes when he was looking from 2008 backwards, because when he started his work again, he was obviously looking at what had happened at that point. I think he reported around about June 2010, but it was actually about speaking what had happened prior to that. So certainly in terms of both experience levels of actual years of experience, it's a much more experienced organisation now than it was at the time that he was looking at it, partly for the reason that I've talked about. And secondly, because of the move that we've made to specialisation, what we have now, instead of a Procurator Fiscal Depute perhaps doing a summary trial one day and then the next week doing a Sheriff and Jury trial, the people that are working Sheriff and Jury work, that's what they work in, it's Sheriff and Jury work. We've also got a significant advocacy training programme that all of our staff go through, and there's advocacy training for the summary level, but there's sort of 2 courses in terms of dealing with sort of the more serious cases that go through Sheriff and Jury Corps.
And setting aside the specialist areas, which is welcome, have these temporary posts, have they translated into substantive new posts? Have your number of prosecutors increased?
It's not increased, no.
I have some questions for Ms Hicks, if I may, please. Yeah, thank you. In relation to the level of contact that you would have with an alleged victim, Ms Hicks, how does that work? And in particular, if the decision ultimately was there to be no proceedings, would that be relayed directly to the complainer in the case? Or should it be, perhaps?
Well, in terms of level of contact, our VIA service, our Victim Information Advice Service, get referred all domestic cases, and even where we take no action in a case, they'll be referred a case, and they will have contact with victims. In terms of prosecutions, the VIA will again make contact with every victim in a domestic case where there are children. They'll be arranging special measures which are automatically entitled to for other victims and witnesses. They will be exploring vulnerability with them and making applications where appropriate. So everyone who is a victim of domestic abuse will have contact by a VIA officer for the cases that we pursue. Obviously, in relation to the court proceedings, our staff will also, who are prosecuting the cases, will very often be speaking directly with victims at court before they actually proceed to trial. So there is quite a considerable amount of contact with them.
In the instance where police deal with an incident and one aspect is domestic violence and there are other related incidents perhaps relating to damage or other things, and the decision was taken not to proceed on the domestic violence but to proceed on the other, is that something that would be relayed to the complainer?
In terms of what charges we were actually going with, yes, I think it would depend on the charges that were going to court. Not every case would go through our victim service. Not every prosecution. It tends to be certain categories. So, race crime, your kind of hate crime dimensions, your domestic cases, your sexual cases. And so it would depend on the nature, I think, of the case going ahead. So,
initially charged as attempted murder, for instance.
As a domestic attempted murder, I think I would really have to kind of look at the specifics of it in terms of what came in. If it was a solemn case, they would get referred to via any petition cases do involving victims. So I would anticipate that there would be contact there at that stage, and they would tell the victim what charges we were ultimately proceeding on.
The reason I ask, I mean, I'm aware this is a budgetary, and if there was a laudable policy that the budget was insufficient to deal with, that's what I'm trying to get at. So that isn't the case with regard to victim contact?
No, I wouldn't say it is. No, the VIA service has been set up and it's well established.
And would a member of a fiscal or a fiscal deputy, would they find themselves speaking with a complainer out with, for instance, a recognition?
Yes, frequently actually there's a lot of contact made by complainers. I set up the domestic abuse unit in Glasgow in 2009 and worked there for a few years, and in that unit we had extensive contact with complainers. Unfortunately, very often in the context of people contacting us wanting to retract their evidence and withdraw charges. So there was extensive contact at that stage. Also, perhaps people had concerns about their children giving evidence or other things like that. So there is a lot of contact. I'd say a lot of it's done through our VIA service because I think we felt it was important that there's a single point of contact for victims. And that's where that service comes in. But if there are issues that people need to speak directly to a legal member of staff, then that's facilitated at that time.
I suppose people get in touch with elected representatives because something's gone wrong or they feel there's a deficiency. People don't get in touch to say, just to let you know it went brilliantly. You know, that's not the nature of it. So if that were the case, with domestic abuse cases, is it yourself that these concerns should be shared directly with?
Absolutely, people could raise that directly with myself. I'll be working very closely with colleagues in policy, and obviously if there are letters from elected representatives, then that's a thing that I would expect to have oversight on, because if there are clearly issues happening around the country, then that's something that I would be looking to address.
Thank you very much.
Comment. Have matters improved in the relationship between the Crown Office and victims that you come across in Victim Support Scotland?
Good afternoon. I think we do, it's fair to say, Victim Support enjoys a very good relationship with not only the Crown but Police Scotland, Scottish Court Service, and we are an integral part of the victim and witness experience. So we do work in close partnership. In answer to your question, could more be done? Absolutely. And as colleagues around the table will be very well aware, the Victims and Witnesses Bill is heading this way anytime soon. And
we're going to stage 2.
And the experience that victims spoke about very powerfully at the start of that evidence was actually to highlight a number of gaps in the system. Their experience of the criminal justice system was, as you'll recall, that they get passed from pillar to post far too often, and they have to repeat their story far too often. So our hope is that actually that the proposed cuts in the justice budget have no impact on what will be a raising of the bar in terms of standards and expectations and rights that are placed on victims and witnesses for them to receive far more than they get currently. And that's a balancing act, but we'll certainly be encouraging the Crown, the Police Scotland and other agencies and organisations to actually make sure that they deliver on the Victims and Witnesses Bill. We will play our part in it very clearly and work in partnership with the statutory organisations. But it's a fine juggling act, but we'll be making sure from our perspective that the needs and the victims and the witnesses are paramount.
Margaret Mitchell.
I was going to ask you, Mr. Claffey, about you. I noticed in your written submission that you mentioned specifically...
Oh, sorry, John, you had finished.
Oh, sorry, have you?
I beg your pardon. I was just going to say, you actually asked the question I was going to ask, Mr. McCloskey.
Oh,
so
I
thank you
didn't
very
realise.
much indeed.
You stopped for breath, which is fatal with me, you see.
We're all queuing up to ask you a question now, Mr.
Margaret Mitchell, yes.
You make specific reference to the 3.4 million real terms cut in the Crown and Procurator Fiscal Service budget, and I think we're seeking some assurances that this wouldn't impact on victims' support. Is that the case? You've mentioned the Vulnerable Witnesses Bill, but I think it was a more general...
Yes, we've obviously highlighted the fact that there is an overall reduction in the Crown's budget in real terms over the next few years, and our primary concern is that if that is the case, then there is no impact on the Victims and Witnesses Bill. That's very clear. So we acknowledge the fact that the Crown has to deal with a reduced budget, and we want to make sure that, acknowledging that the victims and witnesses' needs are protected in amongst all of that. And I'm sure Catherine will elaborate on some of the work that we've done in partnership to actually look at how things can be delivered better for the future, allowing for the fact that they have a reduced budget.
Yeah, I have to say that part of what's going to help us with this is actually the terms of the bill as it is just now, if it goes through, in terms of some automatic rights. At this point, actually, again, if we talk about the resource that we have, we spend a lot in terms of putting together the investigation about whether or not people can apply for special measures. And there's not the automatic entitlement except for the children, really, at this stage. And obviously the bill at the moment has a number of categories, such as domestic offending and sort of sexual offending, where there will be an automatic entitlement. And that in itself will cut down the amount of work in terms of applications that we need to make, because if there's automatic requirement for that, that's what we're sort of looking at just now with colleagues across the court service, etc., to say, well, you know, that's a good thing because we can have certainty for the victim that if it's that kind of offence, instead of what we have to do just now, which is say to them, well, you may, if the sheriff decides, get your special measure, we'll be able to say to them, you definitely will be able to get a special measure, and it will cut down the amount of work that we have to do in terms of letting the court know that they're going to be a victim that needs this.
If I could ask you to comment perhaps on the real terms cut in the Criminal Justice Social Work Grant, and the comment in particular that I think it's amounting to 3.1 million between 14-15, 15-16, the comment that in order to show support for robust community disposals, we will maintain the budgets on, for example, community payback orders. And I think South Lanarkshire Council had said it's disappointing that there wasn't more financial support.
That's generally in terms of the Justice Directorate's budget and what it gives out to local authorities. That's not Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service.
Do you monitor the community payback orders and how they're affected?
The community payback order is a sentence that comes from the court. So really, Crown Office and the Fiscal Service is not involved with sentencing. That's purely for the judiciary, and that again comes into where we're talking about, the different independencies and the responsibilities across the criminal justice system. But I think it's a good example where actually, in terms of how the Justice Board operates, we do discuss all of these things, even if we're not actually responsible for them, so that we're aware of what's going on in the different parts of the justice system, because you're quite correct to indicate that there can be impacts somewhere, but that's actually something that's totally to do with sentencing, so it's not really what we would normally traditionally focus on.
Can I just ask what you were quoting? Which
It's
submission?
South Lanarkshire Commission DB4.
DB4, found
Yeah.
it. Thank you. No, that's right, page 1.
Is there
Thank you.
anything in that cut over the next few years that would impact?
I'm sorry?
In the Criminal Justice Social Work Grant that would impact in the work of the Crown and Procurator Fiscal Service?
I'm not aware of anything. I mean, certainly we haven't had anything. We have some ability to have diversion from prosecution where perhaps people, it looks as if it would be better that they worked with social work diversion or some psychiatric diversion or whatever. So we have arrangements where some of the criminal justice social work people can become involved, but they indicate to us whether they can accept that or not, and I've had nothing to indicate that they don't think they'll be able to continue with that kind of work for us.
That does bring me on to the diversion issue that was raised by families outside, where they were saying they were surprised the draft budget made little mention of support for diversion schemes, referring only to investment in positive opportunities for young people, helping to divert from crime and antisocial behaviour. So I'm wondering just how much the Crown and Procurator Fiscal, are looking at prevention in terms of early intervention when they're looking at a disposal.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think what you're quoting from is all really would be, it's really the sort of Justice Directorate and the budget that they allocate out to sort of various parts of the local authorities or whatever for that, for really criminal justice, social work, etc., what's been given for that. And that's not part of the Crown Office and Fiscal Service. But in terms of early intervention and prevention, again, Aberdeen, I keep mentioning Aberdeen as if it's obviously a highlight, but they obviously seem to try out quite a few things. And that was where the sort of whole systems approach of early intervention for young adults offending came into play. And that's now rolled out across the country as a whole. And there's some very interesting sort of figures from that, which again, I'll make sure that I send you, which is not just a Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service initiative, but again is working with the police and social work, where what we're doing is instead of putting children or adults, young adults to court, where they would traditionally have been because they fell out with the remit of the children's reporter, then we look at the circumstances in a kind of round table, if you like, a virtual round table, and can make the decision that actually the person would be better dealt with, and it would be preventative to have them dealt with by putting them in this early intervention as opposed to bringing them before, say, a justice court, a justice of the peace court. So it's not for things where it's the seriousness requires that there has to be a court disposal. We're sort of saying we could actually deal with this person, that it might be that they could have an intervention that would prevent them from reoffending. So that's the kind of thing that the Procurator Fiscal Service would become involved in, and that's now rolled out across the whole of Scotland, and as I understand is showing some very good results, that the people that go through that do not come back to the notice of the justice system.
Is it the case during the last so many years that the Crown Procurator Fiscal have had much more say over whether it's a fixed penalty, the disposal of cases, and therefore, the choice of whether you're looking at preventative spend, the communication aspect between a young person or someone on drugs, whatever it is, when they're first arrested, and intervening very early there. Yes. How does that all pan out, and how does that play into your priorities and where you allocate budget?
Well, obviously, the position is that what we talk about there would be initial case processing. That's part of one of the work streams that I was talking about, where we've split the staffing into that people pursue a particular type of work for a period of time. So the people there are the people that will be speaking to the police and social work and sometimes the children's reporter to sort of have the conversation about what can we do with this young person where it doesn't look as if it necessarily needs to be that they go to court. Now, I would say probably there's about 47% of our work falls into the direct measure, so that's the fiscal fine, fiscal compensation order, or dealing with some sort of diversion from prosecution. So that's obviously a large volume of the work. And I suppose the proof of that is to sort of say, well, does that work, as opposed to putting people through the more costly route for the whole of the justice system, which is the court system. And certainly, so far, the evidence seems to be, I mean, you'll know that that was really in 2008 was the start of the summary justice reform, as it was Sheriff Principal McInnes's report, which brought in that there were increased levels for fiscal fines, and the fiscals were for the first time able to make fiscal compensation orders. And really it's on the back of that coming in that we've then had the further activity around the whole systems approach, which is going that it's not even giving people a fiscal fine or a fiscal compensation order, but if it's a young person and there's sufficient evidence to indicate that there would be a suitable disposal for them in terms of the social work department. And you know, we've done the risk assessment with the police and we're content ourselves that they go down that route, and that's where they're having the success.
Is there an issue with the collection of these fixable fines? I mean, how much would be outstanding?
Well,
over
in terms of the fiscal fines, what we have is now the position from 2008 was prior to that, it had to be that people made an election, if you like, to accept the fiscal fine. From 2008, what happened was that it was deemed to be accepted if they didn't tell us that they wanted a court hearing. Now, the people that keep the statistics about what's paid are the Scottish Court Service, and again, that's published regularly.
And in terms of, you know, your spending decisions, once you make a spending decision, how do you measure the outcome and the effectiveness of it?
Well, it depends what kind of decision it is, but in terms of everything that we do now, if it's a new way of doing things, if you like, in Crown Office and the Fiscal Service, and so we're looking at things like we've been texting witnesses, we sort of have to look at what the investment is for that, texting them to remind them to come to court, close to the court hearing, and that seems to have been quite successful. So we would deal with it in a sort of project term, that we would sort of have a proper sort of scoping exercise and then a business case to say what we thought that it would cost, what we thought that the savings in the justice system would be, because it's not always just savings to Crown Office and the Fiscal Service. And this is where it comes very useful that we've now got this Justice Board in Scotland, and we have sort of a Justice Finance meeting which Crown Office and the Fiscal Service are invited to, albeit our budget is decided quite separately and independently from the Justice Directorate. But what it does mean is that everybody that's involved in justice in Scotland has the opportunity to hear what's going on with all the other organisations, and really we're trying to align as much as possible when it comes to the saving of money. So it may well be, I mean, in actual fact, it extends even to victim support and other organisations that are sort of traditional representative or support organisations out in the community. So for instance, at the moment, Alan and I have been dealing with a pilot to try and see what would happen if we provided information to victim support and paid for some of the set-up costs of that for Victim Support Scotland to be giving information to witnesses who don't necessarily want to come into contact with VIA or whatever. I think it's very important from the witnesses' point of view that collectively across the justice system we try and design it such that really they've got as few points of contact as possible, but the points of contact that they've got are giving them all the information that they might need. So that's one of the things that we have spent some money on and are working with Victim Support Scotland just in Tayside at the moment, where the police refer every single victim of a crime to Victim Support Scotland, and Alan will correct me if I'm wrong. And what happens there is that Victim Support contact them to see if they want to be kept in touch. And that really means that that's a justice system approach, because obviously Crown Office and the Fiscal Service does not get reported to everything that is reported to the police. And so this is a really quite innovative way where I think we're making sure that the police are reporting everything to Victim Support Scotland. So that's every victim has the opportunity to come into contact with the Victim Support Scotland. And in terms of the information that would normally come from the Crown, perhaps through VIA or perhaps from the witness contacting us themselves, actually we're providing that to Victim Support Scotland. And that means that it's a sort of single point of contact with the victims, which we think is something that we're exploring as a potential way forward.
Can I just ask finally, with the closure of certain sheriff courts, is there an issue about fiscals being available in certain sheriff courts, given the increased workload that will be there at the right time? Is there a logistic issue there?
No, because what we're doing, there's actually only 4 of the courts that are going to be closed are ones where we actually have permanent offices. So actually from our point of view, again, when we're talking about moving resource around or whatever, the focusing in on certain locations as being the places where trials are going to take place and the certainty of that means that that's actually probably helpful to us in terms of where we deploy staff. It also helps us with the victim support, the victim information and advice, personnel. And what we're intending to do is to sort of explore what we can do about the giving out of information, and where it's people that have to come to court, that allows us to concentrate our victim information and advice officers at the courts, because that's obviously going to be quite substantial for us. At the moment, the High Court is going down to 3 principal locations. And again, that's going to be quite important, I think, for us to be able to say to victims and witnesses about certainty of where their case is going to be, because if it goes down to the 3 locations, that's got a much better chance of us being able to predict where their case is going to be, and to make sure that we've got victim information and advice officers on the ground for them. And similarly with the sheriff and jury courts, where again, that's the kind of case that you think people really need support when they're at court, and they get it from the witness service that Alan provides, but also from victim information and advice at court.
And if I could sum up and just confirm if this is the case, given you've got a real terms cut in your resources available to you, given criminal justice has been cut, I think the tenor of your evidence today is that you're quite satisfied with everything and there aren't potential problems. Have I got the wrong end of the stick?
I wouldn't say I'm quite satisfied. I mean, I don't think anybody that's a chief executive of anything would say that they wouldn't quite like to have more. What I'm trying to say is I think that we anticipated, I mean, we've been anticipating really since 2010. It was obvious that we were on this trajectory, and I think it's our responsibility to sort of plan and look and say, the expectation absolutely has to be that we can deal with what comes through the door, what's reported to us, that we can maintain and improve actually the standards that we do in terms of case preparation and our services to victims and witnesses. And what we've done by reorganising ourselves and by constantly working with the police and the courts and the other partners, including people like victim support, is a kind of new approach that we're taking to justice in Scotland that should mean that we can guarantee that we'll be able to deal with what comes through the door. So it's effort and thinking and planning, and it's being innovative. But in terms of what the committee is asking, in terms of an assurance that we'll be able to deliver what we're supposed to be being delivered, that's what I'm saying I can be reassured of.
Can I just finally say, if I were to wave a magic wand and say...
I'm listening.
If I were to wave a magic wand and say, right, you have a single thing that you can have for the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal, what would that thing be that you would ask for?
You can ponder that. We're moving on. We're moving on.
Whatever.
We'll let you chew that over to the end of the meeting, and you just pop that out of somebody's come out with something. Graham and then Elaine, and then I'm hoping we can wind up because we've got an awful lot more on the agenda. Graham?
Right, I'll try and get through the various issues as quickly as I can.
Various issues?
Yeah, I've got 5 questions that I wanted to ask you. The first one about VIA and victim support is, Alan knows I spoke to him after we obtained our evidence from witnesses about their experience of the pass the parcel, as I call it. And I wondered, we don't have level 4 budget figures here for the cost of VIA within Crown Office. And I wondered the benefits of maintaining a separate organisation within the Crown, or whether you could factor out that work to victim support in the long term. Is that feasible, and is it something that you would look at in a substantial sense?
What we're certainly doing just now, I think, with everything across justice, is we're all looking at who needs to deliver it, what is it about the transfer of information. And I think there are things that obviously it would make sense that the prosecution service delivers and delivers at court. In terms of sort of generic information, and we've had a lot of discussion with Victim Support Scotland about if we were able to provide generic information that could be dealt with by the sympathetic person that they've already come into contact with. For some victims, that would be what's needed. For others, it will definitely be that it has to be people that are well aware about how the prosecution system intimately works and doing that. So that's what we're looking at just now.
Have any benefits?
Well, I can certainly get you what you're talking about in terms of the level 4, because obviously we have a discrete amount of staff that we quantify as being the victim information and advice staff. So at the moment, what we're doing is sort of looking across everything. I mean, it's very much in terms of sort of listening to what the police evidence was before. There's a lot of discussion going on with the police And it's not something that Crown Office and the Fiscal Service does alone in this. I think it really is a justice system solution that we're looking at. The other thing, of course, is that the Justice Directorate themselves were looking at whether or not there should be a sort of hub approach for victims and witnesses, again on the same basis that it should be a single point of contact. If it can be, for the vast majority of people, that would be sufficient. It may well then be that if you have to go to court and give evidence, we would see that there was still a role for victim information and advice in that.
But you're not sure in budget terms whether it be attractive or not from your own service point of view? Just in money terms, let's forget the other part of it.
I'm not quite sure what you mean by...
Would you save money by looking at some of these other options? Can you see some savings there, given that you face cuts?
I don't think it would be savings because, I mean, it's got to be, obviously, I think the position from Victim Support Scotland is that this would be Victim Support Scotland doing more. So I think it's more about how that is distributed across the justice system.
Okay. The other point takes me back to Audit Scotland, who didn't present a particularly pleasant picture of the justice system. And one bit that really struck out very significantly is the thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of cases that the police supply into the system, which are then marked for no proceedings for a host of reasonable evidential reasons. Is there any active work being done to reduce that, given that not only is it a waste of police time, but it wastes your fiscal times reading it?
Yeah, I think there is active work being done, and there actually, I think we're beginning to sort of see the fruits of this with Police Scotland, and actually we're hoping to be that when we look at figures, we anticipate that it will have gone down in terms of the sort of no action because of insufficient evidence part of it. I think our experience has been, it's early days obviously with Police Scotland just coming into existence on the 1st of April, but certainly there have been clear demonstrations where, again, because they're doing, as we did, of having staff that focus on particular specialisms in some cases, and for some people that just will be the reporting of standard cases, that quality has gone up in terms of that. So that's a positive that we think we can point to. And certainly we have very close links now because that in Crown Office and the Fiscal Service, we've got sort of local leads in each federation. So, for instance, the bit that you're referring to, where it's the case reporting, there's an ICP, an initial case processing lead for each federation, and that's very closely linked into their opposite number in the police. Now, before that, you know, we just didn't have that. We had 8 police forces, and the way that they were configured within the police forces didn't allow us that. So what that's allowed us to do is to go back very quickly when we see things that we don't think are of the standard, to ask if it can be improved, and we're getting the feedback that it is being improved.
Is it timely enough to get any numbers in relation to that, in figures terms, percentage?
I should be able to do something for you for that.
I think that'd be one. One for Ms Hicks about the domestic abuse courts. There has been an indication of a backlog in cases, particularly in the west of Scotland now, where at one time it was a specified number of days to complete a case. We're now talking in terms of 8 months and more. Is that a budgetary-driven problem, or is there something else that's causing the problem in that regard, given that that's your new responsibility?
The Glasgow Domestic Abuse Court has really experienced a considerable increase in numbers, and that's happened over a period. I think we saw quite significant increases when Strathclyde, Mr House came to Strathclyde Police, and I think a lot of that was to do with the new robust attitude to this and the real top priority it was given within the police force. And it's interesting now, I think, for me coming back to this area of work, and I spoke to Mr House this morning before he gave evidence, and say it feels almost a wee bit like Groundhog Day, because I'm seeing what's happening with some of the rest of the forces, which is what I saw happening with Strathclyde. I think, as an example, I think we noticed during a few years ago that the pilot court in Glasgow, which dealt with one division, in about early 2010, there was a kind of 35% increase in the business just from that division. So that gave you an idea of the scale. We also, in Glasgow, expanded the court to cover the whole of Glasgow. So I think there's a huge increase from that perspective. I think also the attitude of our organisation and the robust approach taken to prosecution. So all of that has, I think, contributed. And also, I think we have to kind of be aware of the real positive in terms of the increase in public confidence, because when you have a specialist court and you put in specialist resource both in the police and the fiscal side of things, you put in a really solid advocacy service for victims and a lot of support in there, then that is going to increase public confidence and get more people reporting, which is what we're wanting to achieve.
Just for the focus of our particular meeting today is about money. So do you have the budget in this year and future years that will deal with that increase in work? And you feel that you've got enough resource to support you to cope with it?
In terms of what the fiscals are doing, yes, we are. I mean, I think the biggest challenge here is it's a criminal justice response in terms of trying to find adequate court capacity to deal with these cases. We have fiscals that can deal with it. We have specialist resource there. So from a budget point of view, that's not a concern. It really is looking at a wider solution in terms of how we address that and get the delay period back down to what it was in the plan.
Asset recovery, there was monies from asset recovery returned to, I think it's Civil Recovery Unit. Is that still part of your budget profile, and will you seek to obtain more money from that source?
What we did with that was put in a particular sort of IT system there, and that obviously it's things like that increase efficiency. So that's the kind of thing that we're looking at, and obviously that's a decision sort of for ministers. But certainly everything that we are doing is trying to be geared, whether it's in civil recovery or across the other areas of COPFS, is to look about what we can do more efficiently, and that's what we would use any additional money that we were given for.
I think it's fair to say that ministers would respond to a bid from Crown Office Procurator Fiscal Service. Would it be the intentions of the Crown Office Procurator Fiscal Service to bid for additional monies from civil recovery, civil recovery?
At the moment, the position is we've used the money that we got, and we've got some efficiencies out of that. In terms of, I don't think it's quite as simple as that. There are some sensitivities around the civil recovery aspect of things, and I think there have been discussions in other jurisdictions where it's quite well seen, I think, for the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, ministers are aware of the position, and they would do that. I don't think it's the position that we've ever put in a bid as such.
I'll stop it.
Well, the last one, I go back to the question I asked the Chief Constable about the joint protocol between Police Scotland and Crown Office in relation to domestic abuse. First of all, what funds are being allocated specifically to implement that protocol? Are they ring-fenced? What are the specific funds? And what difference will that make in practice? And how will it be measured so that we know the money and the protocol is delivering something at the end of the day? I ask both of you that.
I mean, really, I think the position is this has maybe been a bit misunderstood in how we put it out. This is not something that's new. We've already had a protocol. We've got an updated and a new protocol. And the position is...
Given the focus that the Chief Constable now has, it's high in the list of, which is good and well, but what's actually happening now in prosecutions?
Well, in terms of what we've done with that, we've obviously already invested in sort of additional training for staff, and I think there's well over sort of 250 staff in the Procurator Fiscal Service are now trained to deal with domestic abuse cases, and that's at all kinds of stages of them, because obviously the position with domestic abuse is that it's different from other kind of offending. It's not an offence in itself. It comes as an aggravator, if you like, along with a vast array of potential offences. So what we've done with that is already invested previously to try and make sure that we've got the people trained up to recognise that. The protocol sets out for them and for the police very clearly what it is they should be sort of looking for. And it's then obviously investment in having a post like Anne-Marie's to say that we've got somebody that's heading this up for the organisation and that's got oversight of the whole thing, who's a bridge between what might be policy and what's the reality on the ground, and is a sort of very visible contact, if you like, not only for our stakeholders like Scottish Women's Aid, Victim Support and Assist, who we work with closely all the time, but is visible in terms of public visibility, which sometimes the Crown Office and the Fiscal Service in the past has been criticised for. So it's a move to try and sort of put that forward. And I think at the forefront, so far as we're concerned, really, the position with domestic abuse, as Anne-Marie said, there's been so much of an uplift in terms of the reporting of that, which shows an increase in confidence, partly, I would hope, because of the protocol that we previously had with the police, where it was set out clearly what the expectation was of police officers and of Crown Office and the Fiscal Service. That really, I would say that in some senses it's now the biggest identifiable portion and we think it's really mainstream work for us, but I don't know whether Anne-Marie would want to say more than that.
I think the new protocol is really important in terms of improving the quality, and following up from the questions that were asked about, you know, cases where there's no action. There's a lot of improved guidance both for the police and for prosecutors about what we need to get, you know, what should come in terms of an investigation, what the fiscal should have before them, looking at previous incidents, looking at patterns of behaviour, looking at kind of innovative ways of gathering evidence. And so it's really building on what was there, and it's come about largely because of perhaps experience operationally over the last number of years. So I would hope that we'll see a measure of that in terms of improvements in what's reported to us and the cases that we can take action on. Interestingly, one of the other areas was about...
Excuse me, I'm gasping. I mean, nobody had a question and now they're all leaping in. Yes, please continue. It's nothing to do with my gasp and nothing to do with you. Exasperation with them. Yes, please.
I was
yes,
just going
sorry.
to say one of the kind of key things that we looked to change was in relation to counter-allegations, because there was an increase in number of cases that came, and there was a lot of concern from victims groups that perhaps partners were becoming criminalised, where they were, you know, both parties were getting reported. So we've done a lot of work with the police in that, and there's enhanced guidance on that. So we're hoping that all of these things will improve not just what the prosecution's doing, but crucially what the police are doing in improving the investigation.
And ancillary to that, the discussion briefly with the Chief Counsel with regard to what might be diversions from prosecution, you know, not always criminalising, which may not be appropriate in all circumstances. I'm aware of the sensitivity of this, and you'd have to look at very... I take it these are part of the discussions as well, and the fact, what would the, I don't want to say it's all down to money, but what would the implications and resources be for diverting and it going into counselling or whatever? How would that be done?
As far as I understand, what the Chief Constable was trying to indicate was that wasn't what he'd said. I think that's been misinterpreted. What he was talking about was what would be the position about disposals by courts. That was what I understood, and we checked with him this morning before we came in, because it's certainly the way that it was reported, it looked as if he was talking about it. And he said, I think this morning he said that it wasn't always...
I do think he also perhaps said that court, was it, did he? Maybe
He said prison wasn't always...
Prison wasn't always,
yes.
so there would
yes.
still be prosecutions.
I think he was fairly clear, I think, from my understanding of what he said this morning, that he was talking about that this was serious offending, and that he wasn't suggesting...
No, I'm not talking... I'm talking a huge range of offending under domestic abuse,
yes.
and I'm a very narrow range where it might be appropriate, perhaps not for it to go through the criminal process.
We still already have that, and that's set out in the protocol in terms of it.
Right.
That's already been the position, so that's not something that's new. But
right.
in actual fact, I think what people identify as being sort of domestic abuse offending is what most of us would recognise as the type of offending that you need to be in court. But we already have in the protocol sort of quite clear information about what absolutely has to go before a court and what can be looked at in terms of other avenues that would be proportionate for that.
Thank you very much. So you're already doing that. You're already looking at this is not appropriate for this to go to court. It's not in the public interest or in the interest of this family or whatever we take into account. Yes, thank you. Now, 2 small supplementaries. You still wanting them, gentlemen? Yes, if I may. Well, you're not first. Roddy was there before you, and I'm happy to sit here till 6 o'clock tonight if you like. No, I'm not. Yes, Roddy, followed by...
Just back, obviously, touching on corroboration, which we were touching on earlier on. If paragraph 7 of the protocol says, in all cases of domestic abuse where there is sufficient corroborative evidence of crime, the case will be reported to the Procurator Fiscal. If the requirement for corroboration is removed, domestic violence would seem to be one area where the workload might certainly increase.
Well, again, it depends about, I think, you know, I understand you're going to have, obviously, sessions and corroboration, so that will be covered there, but I think the thing to be clear about is it's not suggesting that there will be a need for, you know, just be somebody saying something and that will be taken, that will be a prosecution. It's always got to be that we've got to be mindful that we have to prove it beyond reasonable doubt, and to do that, you normally would have to look for supporting evidence. So there's a difference between what is corroboration in a sort of very narrow legal technical sense, which is what Lord Carloway has been talking about, and about the approach that the prosecution service would take to being able to put witnesses before a court where it was clear that we were going to have supporting evidence that would allow a court to come to the conclusion that we would be asking for in that situation, that the incident had happened beyond reasonable doubt.
We're all desperate on corroboration rates. Actually, budgets were on.
Budget, but in terms of kind of cases which have been referred from the police to you, those number of cases might well increase the workload and therefore cost more money.
That's part of what we've been looking at in all the shadow marking exercises. That was obviously a very clear type of case where there might be other ways if the technical need for corroboration wasn't there.
And that's in the criminal justice submission that you gave to us.
On the subject, thank you, Convener, on the subject of technical support that can be there, and mention was made of police officers arriving at the scene with cameras, and that's sort of after the event, and because the very nature of them being called there, something's happened. Would you be supportive of women being provided with cameras, perhaps as part of, you know, initially?
It's already happening. There are alarms which can be given out, and I know Assist and others are very much involved in that with the police, and as part of them they can have a recording device which can be used.
Specifically talking about video and sound recording, which I understand isn't readily available, which of course in an area like I represent with vulnerability compounded by geographic isolation, that would be of tremendous assistance.
I think we would support kind of getting involved in the discussion and exploring any option that would seem to be, you know, appropriate. I think in terms of what's there and how it could be used, I think, you know, if victims groups and others thought that this was an appropriate way to look at, then we would certainly be supportive of looking at that and getting involved in seeing how it could work.
I mean, it's been used obviously in other sort of scenarios in terms of violence in public transport towards drivers or whatever, and that was something again that in Glasgow they had a sort of scheme that they started off as a pilot one, and I think the issue with it is what's preventative as opposed to what's capturing evidence from the point of view of it, and certainly we would think that that was really something for sort of the people that represent victims groups to sort of have discussions about, but we can see no difficulty with that in terms of if something then came to a prosecution, if that's what you're asking us.
Well, it is, but if I may, that sort of avoids the issue a bit, because you're more or less saying it's for victims group. I'm imagining a situation where perhaps there is insufficient evidence to go on a particular occasion. There's a potential for repeat offending.
Excuse me. What's this got to do with the budget?
Well, I'm coming to that, if you just bear with me.
Good, well, better then.
So the situation is that it is the case that the fiscal can instruct the police to make more inquiries into something. And if this technology was to form part of that, there would be budgetary, I would suggest minor budgetary considerations, but nonetheless there might be.
You got it in.
Certainly we've had sort of discussion where we were with the body-worn camera part of it was that was not available across the whole of Scotland. The Chief Constable's now looked at that, and we've had obviously discussions, and we were encouraging that should happen. So if there are other potential moves that would go either to making people safer, which is obviously something that we're interested in contributing to, or to improving sort of the capture, if you like, of those who are committing crimes, then that's something we're quite happy to sort of take forward. So we're not evading that, you know, we're not suggesting that Crown Office and the Fiscal Service in the wider justice context doesn't have something to do with prevention. We accept that, but really that is something that would have to be a discussion, and it would have to include sort of the victims groups, the police, and the Scottish Government, one would imagine, and we would be quite happy to play a part in that.
Would you initiate discussions on that?
Well, now that you've raised it, certainly we can take it back to the Justice Board.
Oh, I just feel I should have a camera attached to me focusing on John Finney at the moment, but never mind. Yeah, minor budgetary implications. That was very sweetly done. Can I thank you very much for giving your evidence. It's been a long haul for you and for us, but it was very useful. And if you have anything you feel we've missed, please feel free to write to me as convener to be distributed to the committee. I'm now going into private session, and I'll wait for the room to be cleared.